Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Very excited about this next panel on the topic of tech and human relationships. Tech has been a constant theme over the conference so far, even in all of the different the different topics we've covered. But it certainly stands alone as an important topic. I'm just going to yap. Okay, so okay, we are operating a little bit behind schedule, so while people are yapping, I just want to let y'all know that we're going to expedite the spirituality panel, so that will come next. But now that my housekeeping is in order, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Emma Waters. Emma is a policy analyst in the Tech Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation, and her work focuses on family, biotechnology, and reproductive technology. Emma, I will let you take this away.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you all for being here today for this very important conversation on technology and the family. So Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian philosopher and later convert to Christianity, wrote a book in the 20th century called The Medium is the Message. Many of you in this room may be familiar with the general thrust of the book, but I think his primary point serves as a very good opening to our discussion today. So McLuhan argues that the medium is the message. This means that a given technology should be assessed not merely by what it does, but by the social and psychic consequences that it bears upon society. So using the example of the railway, McLuhan goes on to say, "For the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. The railway did not merely introduce movement or transportation or wheel or road into human society, but it accelerated and enlarged the scale of previous human functions, creating totally new kinds of cities and new kinds of work and leisure." He continues that this fact merely underlies the point that the medium is the message, because it is the medium that shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. The content or uses of such media are as diverse as they are ineffectual in shaping the form of human association. Indeed, it is only too typical that the content of any medium blinds us to the character of the medium. And so for our conversation today, the distilled point that I want to reinforce is that when we are talking about technology and human flourishing and the family, we cannot fall into either a thoughtless enthusiasm about the exciting developments that technology promises, nor can we blithely reject it out of hand, hoping to hold on to something that is natural and good and traditional. But we need to take the time to ask very important questions about the nature of our developing technologies and the impact it has upon our way of seeing the world and interacting with each other. Because ultimately, the greatest impact of a given technology is not literally what it does, but how it shapes our worldview and our way of seeing each other. And so without further ado, I am delighted to begin this conversation where our panelists will ask and answer many of those important questions. And so I will begin with the introduction of our first speaker, Mary Harrington. So Mary Harrington is contributing editor at the UK current affairs magazine Unheard. Her work has also been published by The Times, The Mail on Sunday, The Spectator, and The New Statesman, First Things, American Affairs, and many others. Her book, Feminism Against Progress, focuses on women's rights in the biotech age and was published in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Mary.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you especially to Helen and to everyone else for inviting me here. It's a real privilege to be here as part of this conversation. So I really enjoyed John's words just before lunch on his conversion from engineering to the world of beauty. I want to mirror that with a qualified plea for engineers. My title, the theme I want to address today is as follows: truth-seeking is not a pathology. Our topic here, in general, is tech and human relationships. I want to talk about truth in relation to both of those themes. It's all right, I'll leave it here. The relation between technology, human relationships, and truth is a critical contemporary battleground. It's ground zero for the most destructive progressive policies, many of which we've heard discussed this morning. And the fundamental ground zero for these policies is the idea that there's no truth. There's no normative nature to anything, even or perhaps especially people. Meanwhile, those who can still see that some things are more true than others, or indeed more beautiful, are systematically marginalised in modern institutions. I want to offer a short history of how and why we buried truth in favour of power, what that's doing to the civilization that we built, and how, in fact, truth seekers are fighting back in a way some of us here might find counterintuitive, and what all this implies for how we should be thinking about technology in order for it to nourish human relationships rather than working to dissolve or destroy them. To start out, does anyone here remember James Damore? I'm sure some of you. He was fired from Google in 2017. He was an engineer there, a very gifted software engineer. He was fired after a major public pillorying campaign, after he circulated a memo which argued, carefully, with a great deal of evidence, that not all sex differences in employment choice are down to discrimination. Now, this is just simply factually true. Now, recently, though, a free press journalist tracked James Damore down. He lives in Europe now, in Belgium. He's not online at all. I don't think he even has a phone, or he checks it once a day or something. It was a sympathetic piece on his perspective. But what struck me is that the writer suggested that Damore may have an autism spectrum disorder. Okay, with some disclaimers here. I believe that there are some people who find life difficult, who then find themselves diagnosed with autism, and that may be helpful for them. However, I want to ask the question, what if at least some of those individuals who are classified in this category, supposedly disordered, are not in fact disordered at all? What if they're just outlier personalities, more oriented towards truth than social consensus? This certainly seems to be the case for James Damore. He doesn't strike me as disordered, just more interested in truth than being polite. And what if one reason we've got less good at building things, the famous competence crisis, is that the post-truth managerial moral framework has reframed the kind of truth-seeking, which is James Damore's natural disposition, as a pathology? You may be wondering, what does all of this have to do with human relationships? Huh? Isn't Mary here to do the bit about the pill, or whatever? Okay, don't worry, I'll get to that. I'll get to it. But since I wrote Feminism Against Progress a few years back, I've thought some way further into the framing I offered there of the contraceptive pill as an inflection point in the arrival of cyborg culture, or more, in plainer language, as the first mass-market transhumanist technology. Now, in that sense, the pill said, we're entitled to break normative health in the name of human desire. A great deal has followed downstream of the pill in the transhuman era that's germane to what the topic of our conference here: family formation, gender ideology, hostility between the sexes, epidemic loneliness, etc., etc. A great deal of this can and often is indexed to the social and cultural transformations downstream of the contraceptive pill. But, having made all of those arguments in the book, I want to zoom out and think about what was going on in that moment when the pill was first legalised, after the 2 world wars, which was the inflection moment when transhumanism came to seem both possible and plausible and licit. And I want to read that moment as, in some respects, a trauma response to the triumph of engineering in what Peter Thiel calls the world of atoms, which is to say physical machines. You could think of the 2 world wars that happened in the first half of the 20th century as, in aggregate, the climax of Europe's industrial civilization. Total war, total mobilization, total manufacture of machines, all ordered to this frenzy of destruction. And the second of those wars was ended by a truth seeker who split the atom just to see if it could be done. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the physicists who developed the atom bomb, perfectly expresses the engineering, truth-seeking mindset when he said, in 1954, when you see something that's technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you've had your technical success. This is, at its core, the engineer mindset. Engineers want to know, is it technically sweet? And Does it work? The why, or what to do about it, as Oppenheimer puts it, is for many a secondary consideration, which I think speaks to John's point before lunch as to whether it's sweet and whether it works. In God and the Atom, published 1945, the theologian Ronald Knox reflected on the cultural and religious impact of the explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not just the loss of faith that this prompted in a great many people, the sheer level of the death and atrocity, but also what those explosions implied about the telos of the scientific revolution. As Ronald Knox saw it, Nagasaki was one horrific victory of a centuries-long arc of scientific and philosophical development that began with the nominalist William of Ockham, who rejected the notion of abstract universals. I'm compacting a lot here. There's a great deal more nuance to it, but in essence, William of Ockham was the first to reject the idea of abstract universals for an account of reality that began with what we can see and touch empirically. In the wake of his revolutionary arguments, this was really what set off the very earliest germinal beginning of the scientific revolution, downstream of which we found thinkers who bracketed the idea that things have a form and things have a telos. Again, this is what John was speaking to before lunch. And later discarded this idea, the classical and medieval account of the world, including humans, as having a nature and a purpose, or in classical terms, a formal and a final cause, as well as the stuff, the material cause, and the cause and effect, which is the efficient one. Today, we're just used to the material and the efficient cause, and we don't really think about the formal and the final. And this is at scale, this is the modernist mindset, and it's the one that enables the triumph of the engineers over the course of modernity. This is the account of reality that focuses on cause, effect, material substance. It enabled empiricist study of the world. It produced engineering marvels, up to and including all of the weapons that were used in the two world wars, powerful empires, a vast corpus of philosophy. But since the two world wars, we've taken a different path. Peter Thiel, as I mentioned, characterised that turn in technology since the war as away from the world of atoms towards the world of bits. Drugs, turning inwards to psychonauts, taking drugs, going on inner journeys, a radical moral relativism, counterculture, and innovation only in digital realms, social technologies, attempts to engineer our emotions, your therapy culture, no flying cars. Where's my flying car? Why did all of this happen? My best guess is that actually this has something to do with our friend Oppenheimer. What if our turn away from the world of atoms to the world of bits was a civilization recoiling in terror from what we discovered the truth seekers could do? My hypothesis is that in response, we turned our technical skills inward and set about re-engineering ourselves in the hope that nothing like Hiroshima and Nagasaki would ever have to happen again. This is how, in the 1960s, we come to the twin engines of the transhumanist revolution, computing and biotech. The first precursor of the internet was invented in the late 60s, and the first transhumanist technology was the contraceptive pill. Since then, we've directed these researches towards re-engineering human bodies and re-engineering human souls. And I submit that the positive intended outcome was to ensure nothing like Hiroshima or Nagasaki could happen again. But to embark on this project, we've had to apply the nominalist mindset to humans, which is to say, discarding meaning and purpose, focusing only on materiality and on cause and effect. An effort to liberate ourselves from the givens of our own nature, or even to do away with having a nature. Elsewhere, I've characterised this stance as normophobia, the assertion that nothing about us is natural, and therefore everything is open to remodelling, according to whim or desire or ideology. Again, this has led to some potent discoveries. This is really what Emma works on. But if you apply nominalism to people, you end up focusing on everything except what people actually care about. Truth and beauty, for example, meaning and purpose, which in almost all cases means human relationships. And when you scale up this kind of applied technicity to the level of societies and the governments that order them, this blind spot in the shape of meaning and relationships and purpose starts to look like many of the challenges we're discussing here. The collapse in family formation, the bleeding away of rightly ordered sexuality into hedonism or apathy or violence or pornography, the inability to grasp why mass migration is widely unpopular and highly volatile at scale, the disintegration of religious faith. All of these and more are downstream of an anthropology that rejects human meaning and human purpose, for one that sees only cause and effect and materiality to be engineered. This brings us to the central postmodern claim, the post-atomic cultural guiding light. There is no truth, only power. This is the moral assertion at the normophobic core of our efforts to re-engineer ourselves. It's a mindset that says, I can change sex by fiat, provided I have the support of law and moral consensus. It says men and women are interchangeable. It says whole peoples are interchangeable. It says every family structure is equal, and any combination of parents or carers is fine. What matters is love. One of the more jarring and extreme cases in point is, of course, gender ideology. But this is easy to point to not because it succeeds, but because it fails. Even a toddler can see that a man in a dress is still a man. There are many vastly more potent examples, including the pill, which actually does go some considerable distance towards making men and women interchangeable. But even the pill fails to make us completely interchangeable. And, in practice, every application of nominalism to ourselves ends up as a power grab by administrators. Because when something isn't true, you need state power and social pressure to make up the shortfall. James Damore spoke the truth, so he had to be punished, pour encourager les autres. The quintessential character of the long post-Hiroshima 20th century, then, was the application of nominalist science to ourselves, while proliferating institutional power and managerial bureaucracies to cover the resulting concatenating falsehoods. The kind of people who succeed in this managerial culture are those that prioritise social consensus over truth. It's a radical moral relativism built on applying the truth-seeking engineering spirit, applied nominalism, to humans as individuals and at scale. But no truth, only power is not just a cultural, moral and metaphysical dead end, it's also a technological dead end. Though it starts from the kind of empiricist truth-seeking characteristic of engineers, it has become the opposite, a willful blindness to human nature, covered over by ever-expanding bureaucracies and tightening state tyranny. And at this point, it's turned itself on the truth-seekers, which means it's begun to destroy the technological achievements upon which its bureaucracies depend. Think of the HR edict, bring your whole self to work. Anyone who thinks about this for even a moment will realise it isn't actually an invitation to bring your whole self to work. It's a trap for truth-seekers. Most people have enough sense not even to bring their whole self to Christmas dinner with the family, let alone work. It's designed, consciously or not, to surface people like James Damore so they can be offloaded in favour of people who are better at calibrating for social consensus. Over time, though, the aggregate effect of policies like this is to increase the number of consensus seekers, which is to say those adapted to managerialism, and to decrease the number of truth seekers. And the problem with filtering out truth seekers is that you end up firing your best engineers. A good engineer has to be interested in truth. Otherwise, their priority will not be what's technically sweet or what works, but what's socially approved. And we all know what that result is beginning to look like. It's industries where leaders' incentives no longer align with those of the users, what the writer Cory Doctorow calls enshittification. It's when windows start falling out of planes and Google search stops working. Then, finally, the managers will asset strip and sell what the engineers built, chalk that up as growth and move on. The writer Ed Zitron calls this the rot economy. In case you think this sounds terrible, the truth seekers are fighting back. The most cutting-edge tech firms today have realised the structural problem with giving social consensus too much power. Elon Musk makes much of how he wants his Grok AI tool to be maximally truth-seeking. Will it work? I don't know, but I think that's a signal. Nor is he the only one. A leader at a highly successful tech firm, which I can guarantee, I'm not going to name, but I guarantee you'll all have heard of, told me recently his company actively filters for truth-seeking as the number one trait that they search for when they recruit engineers. They also accept that there's a trade-off in abrasiveness with this personality type. Obsessive truth-seeking can make people pretty annoying to work with. But for this firm, that's a secondary consideration. So, some of the most forward-looking people in tech, specifically within AI, have realised that everything now rests on restoring truth-seeking to its central role. No longer a supposed disorder or mental disability hampering the development of managerial soft skills, but a superpower in its own right and in its proper field. Why? Why is this happening? And why does it seem to be connected with AI? Now, I don't want to get sidetracked by artificial general intelligence here, which I think is probably a category error. I want to think about what AI is now. And I think it's often easy to get distracted by the use of the word intelligence. But if we think instead about these tools as extremely powerful modelling and prediction software based on pattern recognition across very large data sets, it's not as catchy, but it's probably a more accurate description of what's going on. Now, for our purpose, the classic example, so the key thing to grasp, is that in order to have a modelling tool with a very large data set, if you want it to work, the data has to be good. The data has to be accurate. You know, as the computing adage has it, garbage in, garbage out. You know, your tool will be useless. Think about the AI, the classic example is the AI image generator with 8 fingers. Now, in the context of, say, a self-driving car, the equivalent of the image of the person with 8 fingers is a road error that kills a pedestrian. Obviously, your data needs to be good, it needs to be accurate, it needs to be true. And this is why, especially as regards AI, I think we need a more complex assessment of what these developments are doing than this is probably scary and bad, or maybe it's demons, or whatever. There's a lot about these tools I find unsettling. If the reaction to their development has been apocalyptic in some quarters, this is surely due to a general intuition that their emergence signals the end of the inward turn in technology and a reorientation, as Peter Thiel is fond of promoting, towards the world of atoms. SpaceX, robot dogs, armed drones, unmanned factories, Iron Dome. I mean, some of these things are kind of unnerving. It's a more frightening picture taken together than what Oppenheimer created, in a sense. It's more total, and it's coming. But while I don't precisely welcome this, what I think we should welcome is the way AI calls us to reorient from social consensus to truth, and shifts the balance of innovation back toward truth seekers. And perhaps also, though it's really too early to tell, the balance of power in governance back towards truth seekers. Because, as James Damore showed, those who prioritise truth over social consensus have been the first to notice that humans still have a nature, no matter what your college teachers or the HR person is insisting. This gestalt of normative features of the human organism and experience that we used to group under the term human nature, and which we discarded when we turned the nominalist scalpel on ourselves. Damore argued very simply that men and women differ somewhat. It's true. He was right. But this is only one way in which the failure of our nominalist experiments on ourselves is making our own nature perceptible again. Half a century into the experiment in making the sexes interchangeable, sex realist feminism has emerged to say, loud and proud, no, actually this isn't true. And furthermore, some of those differences are politically significant. My great friend Erika Bakayaki in the audience has done incredibly important work on really just drawing out the ongoing, meaningful political, social and cultural reality of sex difference. And there are countless other examples. Our efforts to re-engineer our own sex nature is failing, far more subtly than gender-affirming surgery fails, but failing nonetheless. And it's particularly young people who are seeing this and realising that, no, in fact, actually human nature is still a thing. Over time, this is more speculative, but over time I think our attempt and our failure to create artificial general intelligence will force the metaphysical issue on what consciousness is. And that is, perhaps, among the more observant of the truth seekers and the engineers, a path to breaking the nominalist paradigm and bringing meaning and purpose back together with empiricism. This, for me, is a cause of deep hope, even though I think there's a whole other talk to explain what on earth that could look like. But I think there's a phenomenal power and potential there. There may well be some Catholics in the room mentally rolling their eyes at this point and thinking, congratulations, you just invented Thomist. Which, okay, but the point is that there's a great deal more common ground for cooperation between secular and religious truth seekers than you might think. There's a whole other talk to be written on the scope AI perhaps offers to reconcile empiricism and metaphysical idealism. For now, we should stop treating these new technologies of pattern recognition as intelligence in the human sense, and think of them instead as an escape hatch from the dead-end post-war experiment in trying to abolish human nature while leaving the material world to managerialism and stagnation. Instead, we can and should and will turn our inventiveness outwards again. And we must, if we're going to do that, order our technologies to the picture of human nature which is so clearly revealed by the failure of our efforts to re-engineer ourselves. Now, I'm going short on. I'll just wrap up with a handful of practical examples that are indicative of the direction of travel here, and which I think offer real ground for hope. Fertility. There are many startups using AI and advances in wearable tech to support women who don't want to use hormonal contraception in managing their fertility. And what's critical to note about this is that this doesn't seek to make women and men interchangeable with a forcible intervention in women's bodies, but acknowledges and enables constructive working with women's sex-specific physiology. It shifts fertility planning from mastery to a constructive and embodied relationship with physiology. I think there's extraordinary potential in that. In dating, in the US, the startup Keeper uses detailed and very distinctly sex-specific questionnaires, plus AI matching technology, to power an introduction service ordered towards long-term relationships. I believe there are already Keeper engagements, possibly marriages, on the books. Again, the framework is pragmatic acceptance of human nature and ordering of technology towards meaning, purpose, and relationship. To take a more banal, everyday example, the language learning app Duolingo uses AI components, including voice recognition. It really works. My daughter has been teaching herself Italian. She's amazing now. She's been doing it for 2 years, and she's incredible. On a spicier note, speaking to the panel this morning, immigration. Automation of low-skilled work removes most of the pull drivers and the corporate incentives for mass immigration, potentially. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind when we think about, when we worry about AI and automation, that in fact it offers scope with some political ambivalences and a great deal more thinking to do for reversing some of the structural incentives built into governance in favour of a popular pushback against the ongoing free movement of people, shall we say. Finally, defence. Fighting, whether we like it or not, is as much part of human nature as family formation. The deepest hope of the post-war transhumanist experiment was that we might make war obsolete. I think that we only have to look at the newspapers to see that's very comprehensively failed. And we're back in an era of great power conflict. In the light of this, it would be irresponsible of any state with the capacity to improve defence through AI innovation not to pursue this. To sum up then, the age open out in front of us needn't contain artificial general intelligence to be both wondrous and frightening. But there's lots to be optimistic about, not least that the age of relativism is drawing to an end. Done right, AI is a friend to conservatives. It actively elevates truth seekers. This is still a cutting-edge trend, but I expect it to spread. If we want to survive and flourish in this new world, we need not just the empiricist truth of does it work, but also the metaphysical one of is this ordered to human ends? I think it can be done. But before we begin, the first thing we must do is restore truth to its rightful place at the heart of how we think. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And next we have Alexandra. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mary. I was looking at Helen. You're right. I was looking at Helen, the brilliant mind, but thank you, Mary, for those wonderful remarks. Next, we have Alexandra Kashuda. Alex is a writer, cultural critic, and podcast host of Subversive from Transylvania, Romania. Her areas of interest are technology, immigration, religion, gender relations, and the broader emergence of post-liberal politics in Europe and the United States. She has been active as an opinion writer for the better part of a decade and has been featured in the New York Post, The American Mind, I Am 1776, and other outlets. Currently, she is the host of the Subversive podcast and writes for her Substack audience and various other publications. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you so much for the kindness of the organizers, for Melissa and John O'Sullivan's kind request that I come back, and for the wonderful organizational skills of Helen Roy. I'll keep my remarks a little bit short, but I think we'll fit in the schedule today. So once upon a time, not that long ago, a young man met a young woman at a party. He noticed her laugh, the sparkle in her eye, long before the objective ranking of her on a 10-point scale. He made a joke that didn't quite land, but she laughed anyway. He stammered, she smiled, they danced. The room fell away as they became entranced with each other. This is how it began. with awkwardness, with charm, with shared space. Today, that same man might meet her through an app or by sliding into her inbox with carefully curated photos, a 3-line bio, and a swipe. They trade messages like overworked customer service agents, polite, efficient, scripted. Often the connection flickers out before it even begins. Yet, I should pause here because I met my husband online on a dating app. Technology, algorithms, and optimization served us beautifully, but only after we'd both spent years fumbling, stumbling, failing, and growing in the real world. The magic wasn't in the matching algorithm. It was in the lived experience and the messiness we brought to our relationship. So we might say that's just how it is in the modern world, but let's also admit that we risk losing something essential, not just to romance, but to civilization itself. The relationship between men and women isn't just fraying, it's slowly unraveling. And the thing pulling the threads loose is not just technology, but our temptation to let the screen replace the struggle, the awkwardness, and the charm of genuinely connecting with another human being. Technology has made many things easier, but one thing it's made harder, maybe even terrifying, is the first move. Men and women used to meet in person, at school, in church, through friends. Those encounters weren't always smooth or safe, but they were human. Now, young people are raised indoors, with most of their experimentation done in increasingly strange online spaces, who often have an apocalyptic amount of, yes, engaging, negativity built in. They are swaddled in bubble wrap in a culture that teaches them to fear tension instead of leaning into it. I recently watched a stand-up by the comedian Andrew Slater, who made a great observation. When's the last time you saw a kid with a cast on? Remember, there used to be kids with casts everywhere. I used to walk into 3rd grade and it was like a VA hospital. Leg up in the air, a kid with an eye patch. What happened to you? Now the injuries are psychological. They get those online. That's not as fun. No one can autograph your crippling anxiety. Safety as a core directive of life serves to keep more people alive than ever before, yes, but it stunts our growth. We're not pushing young people to become human. We're creating climate-controlled, self-watering bonsai trees in the shape of an adult, but much, much smaller interpersonally. It's true that things you use a lot and experiment with will get broken. But it's also true that things that don't get used will atrophy, especially for young men. Male pattern socialization, roughhousing, teasing, in-person verbal sparring used to teach boys how to tolerate the awkward, how to risk embarrassment and grow from it. It helped them find their niche. Be it through competence, humor, through strength, it gave them the muscles for social life. Socializing with girls also has a lot to teach young men about difference, sure, but also about common humanity. Exposure therapy is still a very underrated teaching method. It works with spiders, it works with your neighbor Jessica. Now, with fewer real friendships and less in-person experience, many young men are socially underdeveloped. They're chronologically adult, but relationally adolescent. The online sphere offers palliatives, comforts for the life you could have lived, but simulations for the person you could have become. The digital world lets you feel powerful, undefeated, untouchable. You can rise through the ranks, rule empires, become a god in a game. But while you were chasing glory online, you missed the harder, quieter, more unrewarding work of becoming a man. And at the same time, the rules of engagement with the opposite sex have multiplied. Don't be creepy, don't be intense, don't ask twice. This is all reasonable and all grounded in real concerns, but when layered with fear and the looming threat of ostracism, especially in the online panopticon, they become paralyzing. So now we have a generation of men too anxious to try and a generation of women disinterested in teaching. And few want to risk talking to the other camp. It's much more comfortable to retreat into the intelligible, non-threatening world of your own species, or even more preferably, of your own head. But it's not just what we're not doing, it's what we've been shown. Technology doesn't just connect us, it curates us. It reflects back a funhouse version of ourselves, but even more so of the alien opposite sex. What we see isn't a person in front of us, it's a feed. It's a meme that says men are emotionally unavailable, a TikTok that warns that women only care about looks, a podcast about hypergamy, a Reddit thread about the iron prison of inceldom, 1,000 ways to prejudge a person before they've even opened their mouth, before they're even in front of you, before you'd even dare. 1,000 ways of convincing yourself that the outside world is impossible to navigate, full of traps and snares you're unequipped to handle before even opening the door. There be dragons. We're left to fill our time reviewing the charts and stick figures and playing dolls with memes. Because we're human, because we have a negativity bias that served us very well when survival was on the line, we believe the worst. We stop seeing men and women as complements. We start seeing each other as threats or statistics or liabilities, as something we need to handle by applying an endless series of scientifically accurate or at least wise influencer-endorsed life hacks too. We benchmark the opposite sex against our own internal template for normality, and anything different feels defective. My dream that more widespread knowledge about the reality of sex differences would herald a new world, that it would create a new language that strengthened the bond between the sexes, is on hold for the time being. Instead, now we have, she's emotional, so she's irrational. He's quiet, so he must be dangerous. Men need therapy. Women need to be disenfranchised. In my dream, the alien other would feel like the enchanting, luminous creature from the movie Avatar. Mysterious, beautiful, worth crossing worlds for. But somewhere along the way, that image morphed, until now, the opposite sex is often seen more like the blood-sucking invaders from War of the Worlds. Dangerous, manipulative, out to conquer or consume. The alien may bite. Understanding has been replaced with strategy. Curiosity has been turned into reconnaissance. We don't approach each other with wonder. We approach each other like generals preparing for war. And in that moment, we lose what actually makes love possible: the curiosity, vulnerability, the play aspect. Dating has morphed from something with market characteristics to something that's closer to the New York Stock Exchange. We assess value, we optimize, we calculate ROI. Is she hot enough? Is he tall enough? Can she give me 5.3 children? Can he afford them? Even well-meaning people now approach love like it's a resume screening. Why? We have the technology. There are an infinity of data centers that hold rows upon rows of parameters about your potential match. If you can just calibrate your search criteria well enough and scour the database with patience and skill, you may find the one. The problem lies in the data that is not collected. How this person makes you feel, how they can relate to you, how they light up a room when they enter it, how they treat their family, how they treat strangers, how they pat a cat when they encounter one on the street, what their t-shirt smells like, and if you'd potentially never want to sleep in anything else for the rest of your life. It's hard to flatten and codify magic, but that's what's missing from the database. At its best, love is not about what you get, about the fulfillment of checklist criteria. It's about what you become through the act of being with another person. But we've been incentivized to view relationships as performance reviews. One wrong answer and you're out. There's no grace, no growth, no mercy. So we tend to stay alone, not because we want to, but because the rules, the tools, and the nudges all push us to avoid risk. And love is a risk, but it's also the greatest reward. Now, I want to say something clearly, which has been stated here before, but I'll repeat it. Technology is not the enemy. In fact, it is miraculous. Besides my fortuitous match and our wonderful resulting children, by the grace of technology, I'm currently patching up my knowledge of statistics through an AI teacher, better than any professor I've ever had. It's extremely responsive, extremely smart, can answer any question. It's really miraculous. Technology connects moms to postpartum resources. It helps single dads find support. It saves countless lives. And yes, it entertains better than anything that's ever been created. But it's so good, so efficient, so frictionless that we begin to avoid the harder things, the ambiguous things, like sitting across from someone who might not get your joke, like asking a question you're not sure is okay, like fumbling a conversation and trying again. These are the interactions that build us, that shape us, that teach us who we are in relation to someone else. Humans are relational creatures. In many ways, what we are is what we are to each other. Our relationships don't just help us, They are us. We are individuals, yes, but we are also a superorganism. Connection is something we need to be participating in. It's our obligation and our birthright, not another thing that we get to consume only when it's convenient and risk-free. But here is the good news. We're not stuck. We can reclaim the dance. It may be that in the peaks and troughs of creative destruction, we are just now in a valley. The next hill is not visible yet, but history taught us that it is there. There may be tensions, struggles, more unexpected manholes that we might trip into, but the destination is there. The mission is as alive and energizing as it's always been. Men and women are not opponents. We're not adversaries or algorithms that need to be hacked. We are partners in the longest running, most miraculous project on Earth: love, family, civilization itself. We also don't need to throw out the phones. We just need to stop letting them do our talking. That means encouraging our sons to risk awkwardness, to let them live, to get their autographs, to bump against real objects and people, and to gain the confidence that they can do it. It means instilling in our daughters that a good man might stumble at first, and that's okay. It means creating spaces, real spaces, for people to meet, laugh, flirt, fail, and grow. And it's already happening. More and more young people see that technology is a wonderful tool that is a terrible master. So do their parents. The hill is starting to take shape on the horizon. We don't need a new app. We need old courage, ancient agency. And it's less about what we tell them, but about the worldview we communicate with our actions, and about having the trust to let them figure the world out for themselves together. So if you remember one thing from today, let it be this. Love isn't a transaction, it's a transformation. And it begins when two people lift their heads just a tiny bit above the screens, look each other in the eye, and say, hi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And next we have Nina Power. Nina Power is an English writer and philosopher. She earned her PhD in philosophy from Middlesex University on the topic of humanism and anti-humanism in post-war French philosophy. She's the author of One-Dimensional Woman, and her most recent book, What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents, was published in 2022. Welcome, Nina.
Thanks, Emma, and thank you to the organisers. I think it's a mark of your openness and generosity that I'm here, possibly curiosity. In the new Trumpian spirit of you can just do things, I will just say things. So, I mean, who knows? I'll keep it to 10 minutes, though, hopefully, right? Okay. I want to argue that today's liberal subjects, which is not you, you're all great, but most people, that they're not only post-Christian, they're not even pagan. And this is a problem. I'm going to explain this. This is to say that there's no sacred or ritual dimension to the immanence of this world for most people as an experience. There's no separation between the inside and the outside, between man and nature, for example, but only really a kind of fusion of utilitarian comfort, the duvet of modernity, with a presentist. I don't know what Hungarian for duvet is. Anyway, you know, like we're all under our duvet. I like my duvet too much. I'm actually going to get rid of it anyway. The duvet of modernity with a presentist convenience and a faux market idea of efficiency. Thus, we have forgotten sacrifice, duty, ritual, and obviously people have been talking about how this contributes to not being willing to commit to marriage, and especially not to children, which are perceived by many to be too difficult and too frightening for a lot of young women in particular, I would say. There is no spirit-infused calendar. We have an ersatz inverted religion, nevertheless, with its saints, murderers of CEOs, and various perverts. Brilliant. I think what this proves, though, is that people are fundamentally religious, and in the absence of a good organised religion, they will invent an awful, horrific, inverted religion. I think there is this sort of point about dating apps that Alex is making in much more detail, but I think when you speak to a lot of people about them, and I'm not discounting the fact that they sometimes have created beautiful, wonderful relationships, they often talk about them as if they're like job interviews, you know, that there is something on the side of a really depressing bureaucracy about the algorithm and the machine. There's no play, there's no seduction. The games that people play are largely preordained. They're computer games. These are all very seductive things. And I think there's a deeper question here about iconoclasm and iconophilia. And in the West, we chose iconophilia, right? And we're living in the aftermath of the escape of icons from the church. Just leave that to one side. We have a sort of sibling rivalry now, a kind of making proximate of men and women at the same time as they are suspicious of one another, treating each other as potentially Me Too oppressors or deranged emotional monsters or whatever. But really, economically, since the Industrial Revolution, we can talk about the way in which men and women have become sibling rivals. There's a horizontalism, a kind of proximity. Separate spheres have largely been dissolved in many ways, unless one makes a conscious effort to restore those traditional divisions. In this sense, we live in the aftermath of the French Revolution's model of fraternity. We are all brothers. The question of mimesis is here very important. We talk about role models and mentors and so on, extremely important. For people online, I think, unlike the current British government's attempt to talk about incels, which is extraordinarily dated and really just a kind of punishment exercise for young white men, we are actually looking at a multipolar world of mentors and influencers and so on online. You know, people with millions of followers that you'd have never heard of who are nevertheless extraordinarily influential. I think in this sense, if Taylor Swift married well and had a happy and public natural pregnancy, this would likely have more of a cascade effect than every last report from any conservative and every conservative think tank put together. Sorry, guys, but it would. I think the sort of movement in terms of sexuality, where it's not just perceived to be abject and a lot of young people are turning away from sex, we might say this is a great thing on the one hand, right? There's an interesting sort of celibate, chaste movement, but it's usually for quite depressing reasons. When Grindr, which was the original gay sort of hookup app, became Tinder, you might remember there was lots of public discussion about whether this would actually work on heterosexual women, on women. And lots of people said, no, it won't. Women need romance and stories and so on. Nevertheless, we've somehow managed to convince ourselves that everyone is the worst possible stereotype of a gay man. And also a eunuch, somehow, anyway. No time for the eunuch thing, but we're all eunuchs and gay men. There's kind of race to the bottom in every possible sense of that. Okay, so I think what I'm interested in here, briefly, is the how we escape from the cave, right? How, for the vast majority of people who are not already who not already made the breakthroughs and have the religion and the background and the order that people have been talking about, how do we get people who were not there out of the cave? I want to say, you know, very depressing statistic. I've only got one stat, I think. Fewer than 1% of the UK population attend church. I mean, it's really like this. So how do we get people back even to paganism? And why am I defending paganism in front of you? But if you think about Plato's classical image of the cave, the escape out of the shadows on the wall is an encounter with the sun. And I would say this is both an allegory and not. It's really the sun. Okay, you can see this in the internet, now quite classical internet imperative, touch grass, right? Get outside. You know, there is a sense in which literally being in the sun, literally having an experience, an encounter with nature is going to be the first stage back out of this virtual world, which is filled with preordained games and stereotypes and so on. People will think you mad, as Plato points out. People will think you're insane. This is, I think, touches on what Mary was saying about truth-seeking. when people state things that everybody used to know and are definitely true, for example, that sexual difference is real and exists and has meaningful effects in every possible realm, people will think you mad. Hopefully less so now. I hope that the era of cancel culture is over, because I can't be cancelled again. Just not going to do it. I think we also have to get not just back through a certain kind of paganism, which is the sort of re-enchantment of nature, including our own nature, physical nature, external nature, but also through particular affects. I would say that horror, for example, cinema and horror films and cinema, these are unbelievable. There's unbelievably good films out there at the moment, which are very reactionary and very conservative, because it's only through horror, it's only in this genre, through a slight mediation and twist, that people can say things that they really want to say and point out, for example, the devastation of city life. Thinking of Beau is Afraid, a great film by Ari Aster. The first 20 minutes is the most dystopian image of a contemporary city in the West you will ever see in your life. And he can do it because it's horror. Okay, but the affect of horror is also a kind of revelation that something is badly wrong. Something is badly wrong with matter. Something is badly wrong with the world. And I think this is one of the ways in which we can get people to, or people are already experiencing a kind of confrontation with reality. Remember that the subtitle of 1818's Frankenstein was The Modern Prometheus. And I think in this dialectical, complex thinking through of our relationship to technology, on both the left and the right, and I think Mary Harrington has made a very good point about this in a fantastic essay she wrote for the Heritage Foundation called Imago DEI, about a certain image of bioegalitarianism, which is to say, she puts it a war on form itself, as a quest to replace a humanity created in the image of God with one whose only characteristic is infinite difference without distinction. And I think the point here is that both parts of the left and both parts of the right share a similar technophilic transhumanist vision, right? So that the right is also at war with itself. There is an existing, as you're well aware, there is an ongoing and very, very important and vital battle, even at the very height of Trump's administration. What is the relationship between the Muskian worldview and a J.D. Vancian worldview? Okay, how are these two things going to play out? How is the Catholic worldview going to cut across the, I don't know what the Muskian thing is, but whatever, it's deranged in many ways. So here, the question is not one of left and right exactly, but rather of a sort of a careful approach to technology and a non-careful approach to technology, one in which sees technology as an end in itself, and the other view which sees technology as means to an end, although we might need to rethink our language of means and ends too. One thing I think that the technophilic worldview seeks to avoid above all is tragedy. And a culture without tragedy is the most tragic of all, right? Remember that the Greeks invented, if you like, that's the wrong word, tragedy as a genre to cope with the invention of writing, right? The schizophrenia that is induced by a new technology that suddenly says you can no longer, you don't need to be next to someone to hear them. Writing allows for very early forms of alienation, very profound forms of alienation. You're hearing a ghost, you're reading the words of someone who isn't there, right? This is without a robust culture that can cope with its own technological developments. We are mad, actually. As my favourite renegade Catholic, Ivan Illich, who was excommunicated or whatever, but he says, like words and text, memory is a child of the alphabet, right? There is extraordinary loss and gain with every new technological development. There will always be trade-offs, and we have to recognise what they are, and we need an art and culture that can cope with the things that happen to us as a consequence of these technological shifts. History, in that sense, is an immense pile-up of trade-offs, we might say. Rather than a progressive idea of history, whether it be of a sort of Whiggish prosperity or the deranged and infinite idea of progress of the current progressives, as it were, which, as Christopher Lasch points out, is less a secular model of the Christian apocalypse than the scientific, a kind of mimicking a political idea of the scientific idea that all problems and pain can be solved with enough time and knowledge, We need a carefully managed regression in some ways, not to an infantile culture, which we have, which is the kind of perpetual adolescence of everybody in a certain sense, but a return to a recognition of those early stages of our culture. We need to, as I say, reenact, I think, the move from pre-paganism to paganism to Christianity. So to admit that most people will not get there without something in between. I don't know how else to put it. Whether it's an encounter with nature, whether it's an encounter with the other, whether it is, however we need to do it, to break people back into being human through an encounter or an experience of the outside and the reality of other people. In this regard, just to finish, there is a small but highly intriguing neo-romantic movement, which is happening, I would say, online, but in the name of getting offline. We see this in a lot of contemporary white male novelists and poets who are not being published by any of the major publishing houses, but are setting up their own publishing houses. Here we see a kind of expanded notion of reason, just as we did after the Enlightenment with the Romantic response to the Enlightenment, which encompasses imagination, feeling, embodiment, and nature. This is an imminent critique of the Enlightenment. The romantic self versus the barely living atomized unit. Here there is an image of the world which is poetic, that deals in chance and contingency and fate. So the random encounter and the conversation with someone that is not mediated through the machine or through the algorithm. Of course, there are dangers here too. The fetishization of romantic love that we saw in the 1960s, as C.S. Lewis puts it, God is love, but love is not God. We run the risk of making neo-gods, neo-pagan gods of things that we've already rehearsed in the 20th century. Nevertheless, this is a very complicated picture of how we get people, back to reality, back to health, back to a certain kind of relationality and indeed happiness. We may risk rerunning the sexual revolution without sex or love. Me Too was perhaps the terror phase of the sexual revolution, with its own scapegoats, Weinstein and so on. I think that the depression and dissociation and anxiety that we see in young people, whilst terrible, is a symptom that we need to understand. If they didn't feel sad, it would be worse, if you see what I mean. That sadness points to a genuine desire for reality, for truth, for beauty, and so on, if you see what I mean. If people stop responding emotionally, this would be the end of everything. It would be even worse if there were no pain. Nevertheless, we should always seek to avoid unnecessary suffering. How do we get people to a place where struggle is real, where difficulty can be encountered and dealt with, and all of the things that people have been talking about? I think we'll see rebellion and resistance, young people whose whole life has become surveillance and containment. You know, the internet is now a combination of your mother, the school, and the police. I mean, this is depressing. We need to make the internet visibly boring, which it is, and that everyone who's gone through lockdowns, Facebook, school, and so on, I think we'll see a punk resistance to the internet. People will get offline. My final point is about meaningful work, and I think work is one of those questions we desperately need to discuss at scale collectively. Not least because of the very rapid shifts in AI and technology, automation, and so on. There's the immigration question that Mary raised. I think we need to look back at those shifts and moments. The Luddites is an obvious one. John Zerzan says of the Luddites carefully, this is not an attack against production on economic grounds. It was above all the violent response of the textile workers to their attempted degradation in the form of inferior work. Right. So this is about a defence of dignity in labour, about meaningful work, about what can and can't be automated. Many of those things are human, relational forms of work, care work, and so on, the things that we cannot and will not give to machines. We need to radically rethink how we're doing that at the national level. We need meaningful work, meaningful relationships. It's the only way out of this hall of mirrors. And it might be choppy and it might be unpleasant to people who are, let's say, already living in an ordered way. It's the only way I think we can get anywhere near a non-fleeting life, one with meaning and purpose for the majority. Thanks.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Nina, for keeping us awake this wonderful afternoon. So last but certainly not least, I am delighted to introduce Francesco Giubile. He is a publisher and writer, president of the Italian conservative think tank, Nazione Futura, and Fondazione Tartarella. Unlike Mary's daughter, I have not used Duolingo to study Italian, so my apologies. Yes, he has published 10 books that have been translated in the United States, Spain, Hungary, Serbia, and Slovenia. He writes for the newspaper Il Giornale and is a member of the editorial board of the European Conservative. Welcome, Francesco.
Thank you very much to the Danube Institute, to Melissa, to John. I have to say that every time that I come to Hungary, I'm quite surprised. This time because I come from Roma, and here we have the ambassador in the Holy See, Edoardo Lasburgo. And in Western Europe, you have to know that if you read the so-called mainstream media, if you read the liberal media, they write that Hungary is not a place for women, and Hungary is a dangerous place for a woman, and that there are not conservative women. But I arrive in Hungary, and I'm in a panel with four really good women, so it's so good. And they are also conservative, but the same is in our country. How you know we have a prime minister that is a woman, but before that, Giorgia Meloni became prime minister. All the media say that the conservatives are against a woman. But in any case, the development of technology over the last century and the speed at which it's evolving have an impact on all of us in many ways. Modern man, thanks to the contribution of technology, thinks is invincible and has forgotten that in addition to material field, there is a spiritual field, which is part of human nature. Today, we live in a society that is characterized by the triumph of two concepts, rationalism and materialism. The first one belongs an Enlightenment vision of the society, starting from the French Revolution. The second to a Marxist vision, starting from, of course, communism. Both of these concepts are linked to the triumph of technique, which is based on the primacy of the human reason and matter. In doing so, the spiritual and immaterial aspect of human nature is completely erased, with a very dangerous consequence. It's not by chance that Pope Benedict XVI devotes much of his theological work to deepening the relationship between faith and reason. In fact, already in the 17th century, Giambattista Vico, which is one of the most important European philosophers, in his work opposed to the Cartesian thought and rationalism. For him, it is necessary to overcome the Cartesian rationalism that had dominated in the 17th century, give back dignity to the humans from history, while nature is the work of God and transcendent our cognitive limits. There is, therefore, a difference between divine and human knowledge. From this difference, we have the constatation of the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. Even Giacomo Leopardi, which is the most important Italian poet, criticized in his work rationalism and the Enlightenment, challenging the view that reason has, I quote Leopardi, lifted us from one barbarity, because, in his opinion, it has precipitated us into another barbarity, to have lost the relationship with the spiritual and God. It's not by chance that the technology is the emblem of modernity. In modernity, God is replaced by science, as well as love for the homeland and the family, as primary kind of relationship. And the defense of human nature are two elements that risk to be lost in modernity, dominated by technology, which impose us a parallel universe of values. And the same happens, for example, with tradition. Tradition is not only the joy of lasting things, but also the sense of continuity, the conviction that the world was not born with us and does not end with us. The criticism of modernity and the reference to tradition are themes dear to the conservative world that denounce the eclipse of the sacred. Augusto del Noce, which was one of the most important Catholic philosophers of the last century, speaks of modernity characterized by a process of de-Christianization, born from the yielding to revolutionary principle and the loss of its roots. This is a trend of the modern era that coincides with the triumph of technology. It's not coincidence that in traditional civilization, the spiritual aspect was as important as the material. If you think, for example, about the Roman Empire, of the Roman Republic, the spiritual field it was central in the Roman society, and the same happened, for example, in the Middle Age. If you go to any Italian city, you can find a square, and in the main square, you can find always a church, because it was linked to the importance of the spiritual power. And today, this is no longer the case, and the triumph of technology is the emblem of the secularization of the West. The technique has permeated every sphere of society, from the economy to the social sphere, changing relationship between people and personal relationship even in families. Technologies have contributed to the disintegration of the concept of community. Over the last 20 or 30 years, the fundamental principles and values that characterize communities, especially in small towns and to some extent also in big cities, have gradually disappeared. Just think of the home central role of the family, the church communities, and the parties. These organizations have lost their influence and with it their social function. This has led to the prevalence of the concept of the individual over that of the community. And, for example, Edmund Burke explained in his famous book, The Reflection on French Revolution, that the community is something central for a conservative. And when the community, of course, is going to be lost, the individualism is becoming central in the society. And we also have replaced the traditional religion with new form of dogmatic religions. Imagine, for example, the so green religion, the environment religion. And the use of social network and mobile phones has generated a greater superficiality in human relation, especially in the new generation, with the paradox. In an interconnected world, we are actually more alone. We think we have a relationship with thousands of people, but in fact, we increase the time spent in front of a screen and decrease real life experience. This generates a growth of loneliness with psychological consequences that are probably underestimated, especially in the new generation. Technology has also a major impact on the political landscape by changing the way we do politics. In particular, the speed with which the contemporary political scenario moves determines the emergence of new categories used to define areas of thought that are of particular relevance in the public debate. It happened a few years ago with, for example, the so-called national populism, sovereignism, and it's happened today with the so-called techno-right. It's an expression used more and more frequently, especially after the support of Elon Musk to Donald Trump in the US presidential election, which is mainly attributed of a negative meaning, but that has actually a much deeper meaning. For several years now, we have been witnessing a primacy of technique over politics that updates the Marxist view of the primacy of economy over politics. As long as the so-called big tech exercised influence or had a privileged relationship with the liberal or the democratic world, especially in the United States, this problem did not exist for, of course, the mainstream media, for the stream world. As soon as there was an approach to the Republicans and to the right, everything changed. The most emblematic case is Facebook. As long as Zuckerberg was close to Democrats, the problem of online censorship and social network influence did not exist. But when Zuckerberg decided to get close to the Trump administration, it became a danger. Yet, during the Biden administration, Zuckerberg himself admitted that the US government had lobbied for content to be censored during the COVID period. This is something against, of course, the First Amendment, and this is something, of course, against the constitutional right of the people. And the same happened with Twitter before Elon Musk bought it. You probably remember when, during the 2020 election period, the account of Donald Trump was shut down. A decision, again, contrary to the free speech and the respect of the First Amendment. If a private company goes so far as to close the account of the President of the United States, imagine what they can do to us, to normal citizens. Yet, even in that case, the liberal politician and media said nothing because it was a Republican president who was affected. They had not understood that a principle had to be defended, and not the specific case. And the principle is that a private company cannot ignore and exceed constitutional rights. Also because social networks are not publishers, but platforms, and so they cannot decide which opinions can be expressed and which not, and censoring opinions. Today, after the principle of the so-called free speech has in part been reestablished, and the Trump administration has embarked on a fight against censorship, woke culture, we began to speak more widely of the so-called techno-right, with a bad meaning, but in reality we are facing a phenomenon that had already developed for many years in the United States. The so-called techno-right is made up of a collection of identities. It ranges from libertarian and paleo-libertarian movement to neo-rationary through the neo-cameralist by Curtis Yarvin to the alt-right. Behind the rise of techno-right, there are phenomena often underestimated, as, for example, cryptocurrency, like, for example, the Bitcoin, that are considered an instrument of freedom. Hence, the role of the so-called crypto-anarchists, but also the culture of gaming and trolling, with trolls, forums, which are new policy tools. The two most well-known representatives of the so-called techno-right are Peter Thiel, you already quoted Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk, whose entrepreneurial rise goes hand in hand with the growth of their political influence, to the point that the US Vice President J.D. Vance is called the political face of the right wing. It's not a mystery the role of Thiel in the rise of J.D. Vance, nor the financial support of Elon Musk to Donald Trump. But the galaxy of the techno-right is more heterogeneous and formed by figures like Alexander Karp, the CEO of Palantir and author of the book The Technological Republic. Today, the right wing has become a global phenomenon that no longer affects only the American politics context, but also Europe. But it would be wrong to think to the so-called techno-right as a monolithic. The exponents of the techno-right are more united by the aversion to some common elements, the woke political agenda, the excess of regulation, the welfare and tribal degeneration of the democratic system, than by a common organic vision of the world and the society. The conservative must not make the same mistake that had made the left in the past, which is becoming the so-called techno-left as handed over the monopoly of technology. So what will be the balance point between the White House and the American big tech? The question is if Trump will balance the power of the big tech. The imaging of the big tech leaders present at the inauguration of the Trump administration represent an hope. He had already assumed that national states were inexorably giving way to digital states and that they were second in command. Trump's aim is evidently to reverse that relationship of force, to put the big techs in the service of his government, and not the opposite. It's difficult to say if Trump will succeed on this, or if, on the contrary, as his detractors claim, his presidency will be hostage of big tech. In conclusion, the challenge that awaits us is not to oppose in general technology, but to regulate and balance it. This applies in particular to development of artificial intelligence. Today we are entering a new phase in which machines risk replacing men. Artificial intelligence can lead to some opportunity, but also present many critical issues, starting from the relationship with ethics. To imagine the development of artificial intelligence without taking into account its ethical aspects is meaning underestimate the risk of this technology. This is particularly true for jobs. How many people will lose their jobs because of artificial intelligence? Besides the danger of fake content that can be used with artificial intelligence-generated images, the main problem is likely to be, as mentioned, the replacement of human. In Italy, for example, the world's first daily newspaper made only with artificial intelligence has been on the newsstands for a month. So in the last month, an Italian newspaper called Il Foglio decided to do an edition only with artificial intelligence. And it's a newspaper with articles and comments made only by computers. This means that in few years, many jobs could be replaced by machine, like, for example, some journalists. Sometimes it's not bad, but in any case. And finally, once again, it's necessary to appeal to a criterion dear to the conservatives, common sense. Only through a gradual approach and common sense, the relationship between man and technique can be balanced. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for those remarks. In the interest of time, I think we will be constrained to one question. So use this question to both answer my remarks and, of course, say the things that you really want to say. So in this conversation, I've been consistently reminded of Brian Johnson, our very own capitalist transhumanist in the United States. And he's frequently said that one day AI will be better at being you than you are. And this idea has quite literally woken me up at night many times, and it isn't helped anymore by the fact that Microsoft's new Copilot AI system also now has ads running where it shows an individual having a text conversation, and then in the middle of the disagreement, screenshotting the conversation, pasting it into AI, and then AI analyzing the conversation and telling them what to say, effectively removing the person and letting AI handle the conflict. And this is just an average advertisement on Instagram. So in lieu of this idea of AI really replicating or attempting to replace even the most intimate aspects of human relationships, the thing that I would like to hear from you all on is what role should the right, should this pro-family consensus, whatever you want to call it, play in shaping the future of technology? Particularly these relational aspects, and what risks come with our engagement or disengagement from its development. And really, what should we demand from our technology, particularly with AI going forward?
Just a very quick thought on that. Well, two actually, okay. One is, just returning to the theme of truth-seeking, I think we underestimate, on the relation between tech and the right, I think it's underestimated how significant the role of, how important the regulation of AI was in driving the tech bros to the right. Because essentially they saw a whole load of constraints being put on their technically sweet engines, which were making them worse. And it made them so boilingly angry that they switched sides. It wasn't just the regulatory stuff. It wasn't just it wasn't just tax. It was partly just, you're making my product worse. I hate you. So that's that really on the relation between tech and the right. That in a sense we have to start from the position. We have to start from the vantage point of, if there's to be an alliance between tech and the right, it has to begin from the premise that we're both working towards something which is true. That's the point of convergence. But just on the subject of truth, I would say, how should tech respond to the development of these potentially very intimate questions and very intimate relations that the machine might have with us? I wonder if that has it backwards. And in fact, the line of inquiry that the right ought to be taking is more directly at the things that we've lost consensus on concerning what consciousness actually is. Rather than trying to determine what artificial intelligence should or shouldn't be doing, we should bracket the question of whether something artificial even can be intelligent and ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say consciousness? What do we mean when we say intelligence? And I think it would be tremendously helpful for conservatives, for the right, to go more directly at that question. And hopefully, I think, if I'm to speculate wildly, I also think it's not a coincidence that in the context of everything which is happening on this front, that metaphysical idealism is once again on the verge of being a respectable philosophical position, where it really hasn't been for the best part of a century, if not more. And those technologists who've gone all the way through the empiricist thing and come out at metaphysical idealism, and there are several actually. The guy who invented semiconductors is now a leading idealist. He's a metaphysical idealist who says, no, you guys have got it all backwards. It's not that we're putting mind in machines. Everything is in mind. And once you start from that vantage point, it's all much easier. And I suppose that's really where I get to. If you start from the vantage point that everything is in mind and try and understand what these computational models do from that perspective, you're in a much healthier position to make prudential judgments about where we should or shouldn't use them.
Yeah, I think there's always the question of sovereignty when you relate to these elements. So you were describing the machine kind of taking over the conflict, the interpersonal conflict. I remember the last time I had to make my way around a map, on an actual physical map. I had a lot of trouble with that, and I'm very grateful for the technology that relieved me of this pressure. But I could imagine that my sovereignty in that space has been somewhat restricted now that I don't have that capacity anymore, even weak as it was. And now I've let the technology take over that corner. I imagine more and more corners of my sovereignty will be encroached on in the same way, willingly, because I'm just not as good. And I wonder how the right might navigate. I don't necessarily have an answer to this. If there should be limits, where to put that limit, where the humans start, where our capacities start and end. Obviously, technology can expand our capacities in many ways. Like now I can navigate all the way to Bombay from my phone. I definitely wouldn't have done that with a paper map. But yeah, it's something that, keeps me up at night as well. And it also speaks to what Mary was talking about. I don't have the answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm sort of torn. I mean, my first instinct is to sort of just say, switch it off and cut the cables. We'll be fine. But I think maybe the counterpart, in keeping with what I was saying in my talk about kind of nature and the body and so on, is how to heal the mind-body split. I mean, if we become metaphysical idealists, we also need to return to, I think, the things that AI and automation is not, right? Which is to say, it is not flesh. It is not a body. It doesn't think. It can't feel, right? It's not real in that sense. It's not human. I think the point of comparison thing is the wrong way exactly of thinking about it. Some of the things that we are also good at is failing, making mistakes, being weak, all of the things that, if you like, Christianity recognizes precisely in our brokenness. And I think somehow to hold on to those things, like we are not machines, we are not efficient, we're not convenient, or any of those things. We're not useful, even. I don't know what we are, but it's holding open that question. And I suppose returning in the first place for all of the people who are now online at scale in the way that I'm talking about to the body in the first place would already be, a lot, right?
Well, please join me in thanking this incredible panel.
That was so refreshing, ladies. Gosh, thank you all. Okay, so we've managed the calendars so that we should begin our political reality of the spiritual dimension panel promptly at now. However, I would like to give everyone just a 5-minute chance to stretch your legs. We've all been on planes as well, so be back here in 5. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'd like to call us all to our seats, please. Thank you. Lighting. Okay, here we are, everyone. We've arrived at the political reality of the spiritual dimension panel, in which we will be asking and hopefully answering, or at least exploring the questions of does faith still matter? Are we entering a post-Christian age, or is spiritual renewal on the horizon? I know everyone here certainly has something interesting and enlightening and faithful to say. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our fabulous moderator, Jonathan Price. Professor Jonathan Price is a Matrasic Fellow at Pusey House at St. Cross College, Oxford University, where he is a member of the law faculty. He has taught topics in classics, theology, and philosophy and law at Oxford for the past 15 years. Since 2006, he has co-organized the annual Vandenberg meetings of the Center of European Renewal. He is a professor of general jurisprudence at Memoria College and founding editor of the European Conservative. He published in National Review, First Things, Washington Times, De Volkskrant, and Die Presse. His novella, Thaddeus, is currently with an agent. Jonathan.
Okay, I'm going to try this for the first time. I'm going to use some tech to make this work, but I wrote it myself. Thank you to the audience that stayed with us. This is my second time presenting at Danube Institute, and I've gotten the graveyard shift, and so I'm happy for the few that remain, the truly committed members of our audience. Thank you to the Institute itself, to John and Melissa O'Sullivan for giving it its energy and life, and its big topics and big enough tent approach to these ideas. And my day job, as you said, I'm a Don in Oxford, where I have a little Center for Theology, Law, and Culture. Come visit us there at Pusey House. Come see us and attend some of the events. But now I'm also happily a visiting fellow of the Danube Institute. So at least for the coming year, and maybe more years after that, I hope to be here, to be present, and to participate in these events. Dispositionally, I'm a philosopher hiding in a law faculty, and I tend to ask philosophical questions and give theological answers. So be prepared. That's what I do. So if you don't like it, that you know where the exits are. This conference on family formation is taking place, fittingly, I think, today on the 25th anniversary of St. John Paul II's death, who was today, that is, the patron saint of families. I don't know if that's been mentioned before, but it is something to keep in mind and something fortuitous. The panel is called The Political Reality of the Spiritual Dimension, and I'm going to take about 8 minutes to map this out and then turn things over to the esteemed panelists, each to give an intervention of about 10 minutes. So, how does faith and or religion matter today in public life and politics? Are we truly entering a post-Christian age, or is renewal of some kind emerging? Can the Christian tradition coexist meaningfully with late modern post-liberalism, or even late modern hyperliberalism? Two separate questions. Let me give a little bit about the context with two images first. One is that politics is often both a thermometer of the spiritual and a thermostat of the spiritual. That is, it indicates and influences. And the reverse can and is often true. Spiritual life often indicates something about politics, and it influences politics. But influences and indicates what? And what is the current direction of travel, or what are the current directions of travel between these? An open question here is we're talking about this in the context of family formation. My question as a philosopher hiding in a law faculty is an ancient one in a modern idiom. Why aren't modern political animals having little political animals? Right? Why aren't they? I suggest it is chiefly because we lack two forms of piety, civic and spiritual. We don't all lack these, but as a culture, by and large, I believe we now lack these. These are two words from one root, from pietas. The ancient Roman concept was duty toward family, nation, and the gods, requiring sacrifices for the present, polis, and for future generations. This was ultimately a civic virtue that carried other virtues inside it. Moving from Rome back to Athens, Socrates, who was the great gadfly of Athens, taking hemlock at the command of the Athenian authorities, would be an example of this form of pietas. The medieval theological concept, pietas, or as we would call it in modern English, piety, we're much more familiar with. And so I'll jump to today, piety, or faith plus works, or living faith, we might call it, involves sacrificing immediate comforts for long-term goods, perhaps for permanent or eternal goods. Not only giving Sunday to the Lord, prayer, fasting, tithe, charity, but being fruitful and multiplying, raising children, serving the political community, preserving good or the good in tradition, and rendering to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. The contemporary challenge is that without faith or pietas, societies often prioritize immediate gratification and avoid hard tasks such as caring for the young or even having the young and caring for the elderly. I'm not saying anything new here, but I'm trying to articulate this as what I believe to be the real source of the problem, which I'm happy to have great disagreement on. Although I suspect panelists might not be where the great disagreement comes from. Maybe from you all later at dinner we can have it out. But without faith or pietas, individuals also, I think, rightly prioritize the present. There is no heaven to go to, and no patria or ancestors to serve. This was always the spiritual problem with communism and contributed to its collapse. And it's now the spiritual problem, I think, of late liberalism and of post-liberalism, as I've heard it articulated. We have a loss of the eschatological meaning, or of any eschatological meaning. Consider secularization in this light, with this loss of meaning. It's a significant culture and political issue that many great scholars have dealt with. Charles Taylor's most famous, but it's been dealt with. I don't think it's been dealt with quite enough, even though we've heard a lot about it, because society, while not fully post-secular, is somehow post-secularist, but it's no longer rechristened, nor Christianed. What is it? I need a word. It's no longer Christian. It's not become Christian again. It's diffuse. It's not neither pagan nor Christian. It's diffuse. And there's simultaneously a danger of losing a balance between temporal authorities of Caesar and spiritual truths or God. There's an importance now of maintaining the distinction and honoring both. Otherwise, we might get a statist post-liberalism without any common spiritual life. Neither Christian nor pagan, nor much of anything else, but an ironic fulfillment of the promises of the 20th century totalitarian regimes. Very briefly, 3 questions to explore, and then I will turn it over to our eminent speakers, whom I will just introduce very briefly and allow to proceed in order that you find them in your program. How do religious beliefs and metaphysical commitments concretely shape policy and governance? How do they? Not how did they or how can they, but how do they? Does it matter, for instance, that we have regimes that are maybe more favorable to people like us that have very curious metaphysical and spiritual commitments, including some persons at the top of the American government? Mr. Musk is not a Sunday Christian, for instance. It's unclear precisely what he is. Can societies rediscover or re-enchant public life? Is it possible? Is it possible? We like the idea, but is it possible? And how? What practical steps or policies might promote spiritual renewal and civic responsibility? With that said, we will have 4 speakers now. We'll have His Excellency Edward Habsburg's Lothringen. We will have Spencer Klaven. We will have Joseph Bacom and Solin Tadi. Thank you, and you'll hear much less from me now and much more from them.
So, thank you very much for having come back once more after lunch to listen to us here. I'm going to speak about Christian faith, in my case Catholic faith, in the politics and in public space. And I want to begin with the reason why I think that many Christian democratic politicians nowadays don't speak about their faith anymore. And there is an interesting book by Vladimir Palko. He was a Slovak minister of the interior. And it came out in around 2014. And it's called The Lions Are Coming. And it's a book basically encouraging us as Christians to prepare for the persecution that's going to come. The persecution in the style of the 21st century, which is being shut down and being ignored and being attacked by the media and all that. And he has one chapter where he says, why are Christian democratic parties so free of Christian visible faith nowadays? And he says the culprit is John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy had the problem that he wanted to become president of the United States, but that he was seen as an agent of the Vatican and dangerous as a Catholic. The idea was he was taking his orders from the Pope and not from the American people. So, in a very timely fashion, in the right moment, at some event at the Southern Baptist Convention, if I recall correctly, he made a speech where he more or less said, my religious faith will not influence my political decisions. And that is something where Palko shows how, like in a domino effect, it went all through, this speech was handed around all through Europe, and all the Christian Democrat politicians read this and said, perhaps that's not a bad idea. If we don't bother people too much with our faith, then more people might vote for us. And that led to Christian Democrat parties who first were very visibly Christian and anti-abortion and pro-life and all that, slowly pulling back from these two visible Christian things, and in the end, overtaking the more right-wing parties on the left and being the forerunners of woke things nowadays sometimes. So all of that happened, and we've grown used to the idea that a politician should not carry his or her faith before her. On the contrary, the less one sees of it, the better the chance that you would get more votes. And that's why, at least in the western part of Europe, you never meet a politician that speaks about being a Christian. You don't. For me, it was almost shocking when I began working for the Hungarian government to interact with ministers and state secretaries and people working that simply spoke about their faith. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Peter Szijjártó, wherever he goes, even if it's in an Arab country, he will go to an early morning mass and post pictures of it. Orban, I don't have to tell you, most people think that Orban is Catholic. They're always shocked when I tell them that he's a Reformatus Calvinist. What I'm saying is, in Hungary, this is something more normal. You speak about your Christian faith as a politician, but in the West, not at all. And for me, as a diplomat, it was very important from the beginning, especially as I am very visibly present on X, and since about 12 years, I went in guns blazing, friendly because I'm a diplomat and a nice person, but I never shied back from speaking about my faith. I do it in a fun way, in a quirky way, in a visible way. I will sometimes post pictures of me holding a rosary. But I will speak about my faith in between talking about politics or the Vatican or movies. I will always slip in something about my faith, but in a friendly and nice and warm-hearted way. And you wouldn't believe how many incredible stories began because I was open about my faith in the public square. So many people writing me direct messages asking me to pray for them. And on direct message, I began conversations with people that led to me, of course, praying for them every day, and them sharing the terrible disease of their daughter that I was supposed to pray for, and sharing it over months, praying every day, and many such stories that led to friendships. And there is a rather famous author that I'm friends with via direct message because I pray for her and her intentions. Nobody knows that. What I'm saying is, you may be the only person that these people ever meet who is visibly Christian, and you may be the person that might be an absolute turning point in the life of people out there in the public space, on X. So don't shy away from that. I gave a series of talks in London, and I signed my books afterwards. One of them was in a club. The other one was in Brompton Oratory, so that's a bit more Catholic surrounding. But the other one's a club. And I used my talk about the Habsburg family to speak about the faith of the Habsburgs and my personal faith. I just did it. At the end of the talk, 2 or 3 people, when they came to sign the books, said to me, "Thank you for speaking up about your faith. Nobody does this in England." Talking about your personal Catholic faith. So, we live in a world where there is so much information, such an incredible amount of information running through our days. If we as Christians try to blend in with a secular crowd in order to reach more people, we'll be gone. If we stand out by speaking about our faith, I mean, of course, you have to believe to do that. You can't do that for fun. Then we will leave an impression and we will start hope in people. And it can, if you do this in a respectful way, then you will be even respected by those who don't believe. I very often get a feedback, okay, I'm not a Christian, and normally I would be angry for you to, but you did it, and so yeah. So I strongly encourage you to do this. For me, this is a natural thing, first of all, because I'm a Habsburg. And we had the question before from you is, can the personal faith of a politician influence his or her politics? I think it should. I believe that if politicians were open about their faith, it would be good for the voters because they would know which criteria would lead a politician to do what. Now, the example that I always will carry in my heart is, of course, Blessed Emperor Karl, whom I also quoted yesterday, and his relic is about 300 meters in that direction in Matthias-Templum. He was not only, as I said yesterday, an example for family. He had 8 children. He loved his wife dearly. He lived his faith visibly, but his Catholic faith also influenced his decisions in politics. For instance, he founded the first ministry for social questions in Europe because of the Catholic social teaching. So I have a lot of hope that right now, even if they're a bit sometimes like wild teenagers, in the United States you have a whole gang of visible Catholics around the presidents. You have a vice president that will take his children to pray in Notre Dame. It's unthinkable. Here in Europe, people, I think, are terrified by what's happening in the States, but I'm very, very happy. It's in a way, it's a hope for a new era, and I want to encourage everybody to be outspoken about your faith in a friendly way, in the public square, even if you are a politician. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. It's been such a blessing to be part of these conversations over the last 2 days, and I think what I am about to say will hopefully segue nicely from the remarks from the ambassador about just recognizing the challenges of expressing personal faith in the public square. And what I'm going to argue in part is that it is inevitable that we will make religious expressions in the public square because all morality, all legislation is moral legislation. Somebody is always legislating their morality. Therefore, we want good morality to be legislated rather than bad morality. And that all of these debates ultimately boil down to competing truth claims that we find in Scripture. And as we've been in the details of policy, I'm going to zoom out as far back as you can zoom out, back to the beginning, like literally in the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, to talk about the spiritual origins of our political battles. Because what we find in the first 2 chapters of the Bible is God's picture of what human flourishing looks like before sin. We have two chapters that give us a window into a perfect, sinless world. And so we get clues as to the building blocks of human flourishing as God intended for his creation. And they are as follows. He created us, male and female. Now, until a few minutes ago, historically speaking, it wasn't that interesting in Genesis 1:27 when you read, male and female, he created us, because it seemed self-evident. It was maybe so self-evident it didn't need to be said, but now we understand that it needed to be said. But that's a critical part of the identity that God gave us. Then he put the men together, men and women together in a marriage. We see the first marriage, and then we see marriages throughout Scripture. And in fact, the Bible ends with a marriage in Revelation, with Christ and his church in heaven, right? Marriage at the beginning, marriage at the end. It's a critical part of the human experience and what God intended for his creation. But when he put that marriage together, he had something for them to do. He said, be fruitful and multiply. And we've talked about the challenges with the inability to obey this command at length over the last 2 days. And then he said, rule and subdue. While you are being fruitful and multiplying, and in fact being fruitful and multiplying will help you rule and subdue. This is the foundation of human flourishing. So when we get to heaven, we live in a perfect world once again. This will still be part of the experience of what it means to be created in the image of God. Now, we know that Genesis chapter 3 happens, right? God tells us this is what's good for you, and the serpent comes to Eve and asks the question, did God really say? About everything that he just told us is good in the first 2 chapters. Did he make us male and female? Well, now I can take you to the websites that are confident that the answer to that question is no. Did God create marriage as a relationship between a man and a woman? Well, it depends on what we want. Maybe not. Maybe God didn't actually know what he was doing. Did God command us to be fruitful and multiply? Well, no, because my body, my choice. Or even, maybe is it not only your choice, you in fact have the imperative to say no, because we understand that people are not the crown of God's creation. We are a parasite and a threat to our mother, which is why you see propaganda like this. Save the earth, don't give birth. Should we rule and subdue and take dominion over the earth? Well, of course, we know the answer to that is also no in many cases. Why? And here's a quote from James Lovelock that summarizes that well. The big threat to the planet is people. There are too many doing too well economically and burning too much oil. Everything that God said is good, Satan says no. And we distill these down to different political debates. But for those of us who understand the creation order intentionality in the spiritual war in which we live, these political debates are manifestations of the spiritual war that has been taking place since the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Now, not only does Satan have a counter-narrative to everything God said was good in the first 2 chapters of Genesis when it comes to male and female and marriage and children and ruling and subduing, he also presents a very different view of happiness, because fortunately, the Bible does not end in Genesis chapter 3. And it gives us lots of wisdom, how to live in a fallen world and how to, in fact, have a purpose. It's summarized in our various catechisms this way. We have competing paths to joy. The Protestant catechism, this is the Westminster Catechism, would express it this way. What is the chief end of man? The answer is, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. The Catholic Catechism says it this way. For this reason, at every time and in every place, God draws close to man. He calls man to seek him, to know him, to love him with all his strength. That is our purpose. Now, Jesus says it very specifically this way. He who seeks to save his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake and the gospel will find it. So what Scripture makes clear is that it is in the giving up of your desires, of the things that your corrupted, broken heart might want, in pursuit of the things that you are actually created for, you find the things that you really want, like joy. Jesus says it this way in Matthew 6, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." Now, in the United States and other parts of the world, there's something referred to as the prosperity gospel, where God is basically this genie. And if you perform enough tricks for him, if you do enough good things, then he will dispense tokens of goodness to you. So it's transactional, your relationship with God. I obey, and then he gives me the stuff that I want. That's why I obey, right? And that's how a lot of people interpret this passage. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. I now think about this very differently, as you might guess, in that as we fulfill the purpose God created us for us, this is my identity. This is the family that he'd put me in. I'm going to obey his command by being fruitful and multiplying, and then I'm going to rule and subdue and take dominion over the things that he gave me and be good stewards of them. Along that path of obedience to my Creator, wouldn't you know it, all these things will be added to you. Because as you follow the plan, it turns out all the things that we are tempted to make primary, joy, happiness, contentment, all of those things that we are inclined to seek as an end to themselves, end up being added to us because we live according to our created purpose, which is obedience to our Creator. This is the biblical path to joy. Now, everyone in this room understands that there is a competing theory about the right path to joy, rooted in Genesis chapter 3. Things like follow your heart, live authentically, you do you, which is where all of this comes from. Just do what your desires encourage you to do, and that is the narrative of the sexual revolution. And of course, do what makes you comfortable at all times. And I would suggest this exhortation from the world is a big part of the natalism problem that we are facing civilizationally. Why? Because marriage is not comfortable. If the chief aim of your life is comfort, you are disinclined to attach yourself to a permanent commitment, not knowing what might be around the corner. Because that could get uncomfortable, and for those of us who are in the room and have been married, not only could it get uncomfortable, it will get uncomfortable, right? It's a certainty of that institution. So if you value comfort above all else, you're going to be disinclined to get married. And we have seen evidence of that. And of course, we know that parenting also is highly uncomfortable. So if comfort is our great goal, we will see less marriage, we will see fewer kids, and indeed, as we have made comfort our primary goal, we have seen less marriage and fewer kids. And that's how we behave personally. But the path to joy also tells us culturally, and the sexual revolution has made this a point of emphasis, that we should permit anything that makes others happy. And I'd like to make a connection that might seem attenuated for a moment between illegal immigration and the problem of men in women's sports. Why do we tolerate these two things? The issues are connected by the belief that, well, if it makes them happy, we should let them do it. It doesn't just drive personal decisions that we make, it motivates many of our policy decisions. And, as we are seeing, is causing civilizational problems. Now, there is, of course, a lot of science around happiness and what it is that makes us happy. And I'm going to make a very long conversation exceedingly short here. But the highlight is the keys to happiness, the habits of happiness that determine how well we do, are all connected to our faith, our identity and our purpose, our family, our friendships, so the people in our lives, and our work. This is what the science says about what it means to be happy. Now, to take this conversation full circle, you'll find that faith, family, friendship, and work track quite nicely with what we see in Genesis 1 and 2. Male and female, who am I? What is my relationships? What is my purpose? Marriage. What should I do with my life? Have a family. Rule and subdue. Be fruitful and multiply. Serve others. Produce something. So what we find, as we've been on this journey for happiness that has unequivocally made us all more miserable, that the plan was always there at the beginning, it's always been revealed to us, should we choose to submit ourselves to it. And that's what many of us are saying, no thank you, I'd rather be miserable yet in control. And that's what we have said as a culture and suffer the consequences of it. Of course, we're not the first people to do that. But the thesis, the hard thing is the good thing. And if we want to change our civilizational problems, we will have to change the way we think about the purpose of our lives and the path to joy. Because the hard thing is the good thing, and it also happens to be the path to joy. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Helen. I think I speak for all of us when I say this has really just been a true delight. Thank you for the invitation and for everybody that's absolutely. The nice thing about going last is I feel like I've already gotten so much out of this that I basically don't have to say anything at all. And in fact, I'm not totally sure there's much left to be said, but I want to try. There is a passage in the Reflections on the Revolutions in France where Edmund Burke reviews the latest demographic data that came out of the French monarchy before the revolution. And he finds that generally the population was on an upward trajectory. And he says, I do not attribute this, that is this steadily increasing population, I do not attribute this to the deposed government, because I do not like to compliment the contrivances of men with what is due in a great degree to the bounty of Providence. But I never will suppose that fabric of a state to be the worst of all political institutions, which, by experience, is found to contain a principle favorable, however latent it may be, to the increase of mankind. In other words, the monarchy can't have been all that bad if it wasn't tamping down fertility, if it wasn't actively suppressing procreation and the continuation of the species. And I don't want to say much about this one way or the other as an argument for the Ancien regime. I have no dog in that fight, at least at this particular moment. But one way to make this, quote, relevant to everything we've been discussing is to flip it on its head and to say, no system of government, no society, no civilization can be doing all that well, no matter what else it may offer to its citizens, if, in fact, there is a principle found within it, however latent it may be, conducive to the decrease of mankind. And that's the problem that we've been talking about and trying to wrap our heads around, I think, in a nutshell, is that so many of our cherished institutions, governments, political regimes seem to be hiding latent principles that are suppressing our fertility. But the other part of what Burke has to say that is germane directly to what we're here in this panel to talk about is that at the end, there's no sense attributing to government what ultimately must arise and come out of providence. That is the act of God and the role of faith and religious belief. Ambassador Habsburg, at the very beginning of our time together, you mentioned the secret sauce of your family. What is it that encourages you to keep having kids, keep raising kids? And you said it was your faith, and now you've talked at greater length about this. This is not a footnote. This is sort of the indispensable ingredient, and we've now heard that emphasized by Catherine and Tim and a number of others. And at least where I'm from, in the States, we have suddenly new reason to be a little bit hopeful that this essential ingredient is back in fashion in some way, that there's an incipient return to religious belief. And I share that optimism, I'm excited about some of the trends we're seeing in the U.S. I also think it's very early days, and there are some challenges ahead for the revival that may or may not be upon us. And so, since I think we may hear and talk a little bit about the return to religious faith, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges or where we might be going from here, if in fact what we want, as I suspect we all do, is some kind of recovery of a general public consensus around Christendom and its cultural inheritance. When I was in high school in the early 2000s, it used to be really, really edgy to say that you were spiritual but not religious. This was considered kind of like Reddit cool before there was Reddit. By now, this has become a fairly tiresome meme, because those of us who believe in the value of actual religion, that is, going to church, observing spiritual practices and moral claims, have come to think of this as kind of a way of deflecting from the troublesome business that involves actually landing on any definite ideas about God and or doing anything about them, which might involve tricky moral obligations and social commitments of the kind that we just heard about. There's a wonderful passage in C.S. Lewis's Miracles where he talks about exactly this problem. He writes, "An impersonal God, well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, and goodness inside our own heads, better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap, best of all. But God himself, alive, pulling at the other end of the cord, perhaps approaching at an infinite speed, the hunter, king, husband, that is quite another matter. There comes a moment when the children who have been playing at burglars hush suddenly. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, man's search for God, suddenly draw back, supposing we really found him. We never meant it to come to that. We're still supposing he had found us." So this is, I think, the problem that religious people see in the spiritual but not religious trope. And that is why it gives me absolutely no pleasure to say this, but I think the data may be showing that in the States, at least, we are entering into a period where a lot of people are going to become exactly that, spiritual but not religious, if they're not that already. There was a big Pew result recently from the Religious Landscape Study, which has been tracking church attendance and a number of other things in the U.S. for many years. They surveyed more than 35,000 Americans in all 50 states about their religious affiliations. And the headline that was associated with this update was that the steady decline in church attendance, which we've been seeing for my whole lifetime, might be bottoming out. We might be reaching an inflection point where at least it's not getting worse. So this was good news, and is, I think, good news. But there's a lot of interesting and less unambiguously positive stuff if you scroll a little further down through what I think they now call the crosstabs. My degree was in classics, and I don't know anything about numbers, so bear with me. But the major result that most interests me from this poll is that all across age groups in the United States, throughout kind of different demographics, spiritual beliefs are incredibly widespread. So I'll just rattle some of these off. 86% of people, U.S. adults, believe people have a soul or spirit in addition to their physical body. 83% believe in God or a universal spirit. 79% believe there is something spiritual beyond the natural world, even if we can't see it. 70% believe in an afterlife, heaven, hell, or both. So this is a kind of least common denominator spirituality. There's something beyond us. The world is more than gunk and debris. I am more than a chemistry set in a meat sack. I mean, I would think of this as kind of 101 for admission to the conversation. But then you combine that with the fact that among younger Americans, even though the decline is slowing down, actual church attendance is still vastly lower than older generations. So those ages 18 to 24 are vastly less likely to identify as Christian than those ages 74 and older. So it's 46% of the young versus 80% of the older. 27% of the young pray daily versus 58% of their elders. 25% say they attend religious services at least monthly versus 49% of their elders. And so this looks to me like a return, in the wake of the various failures of materialism that we've been discussing, a return to a kind of ambient theism. And one thing that we can, I think, do that is very instructive is ask what this looks like on the ground. Nina was calling earlier for a return to paganism, a kind of upward ascent. Lewis talks about the man coming up from below in another passage. And one thing I'd like to propose is that in the States, that ascent may be already going on, and be careful what you wish for, because what it looks like in practice is basically sun and steel for the fellas, stars and crystals for the ladies. If you're not as kind of like terminally online as I am, this takes a lot of different forms that you will probably recognize and know from your personal relationships. Revived and really sincere interest in astrology, yoga. I mentioned sun and steel, this kind of Mishima philosophy of vitalism. We're going to go to the gym, and that's going to save us. Of course, tech messianism, and Brian Johnson's already been mentioned, so I don't need to fear speaking the unholy name in the room. But the idea that we're going to use tech to live forever, we're going to build God. Guys, it's going to be great. We have this brick and this mortar. We're going to make a tower. It's top will be in the heavens. Nobody's ever tried it before. Bro, let me tell you about it. So these are, examples. Others include, various varieties of shamanism. We've already talked about environmental apocalypticism. Even the massive revival of Stoicism that's going on. I don't know if you know about this, but the Reddit thread r/Stoicism has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers. It's made it into self-help. It's something that, when I teach Greek literature, this is one thing everybody wants to know about, is how can I be like Marcus Aurelius? And I would file that under the revival of paganism as well. You could potentially even add the manospheric Islam of an Andrew Tate if you're like me, you don't really accept the sincerity of his actual Islam. Rod Dreher just wrote a great Substack about some of these practices coming up in a big way, even in Christian circles, this sort of spirituality, New Age spirituality, really taking hold of people's imaginations. And I don't think it's too glib to call this a neo-paganism or a pagan revival. There's lots of things, and I'm far from the first person to point this out, these movements have a lot in common with actual OG, bona fide paganism. It involves a renewed interest in ritual, in mysticism, eschatology, the connection between man and nature, and of course sacrifice, which is a really dark element of some of the environmental dimensions of this. So, Daniel Davidson has written a book called Pagan America. There are other versions of this argument out there. And I would say that much like with old-fashioned paganism, you can abstract from a lot of these modern practices a generalized myth to the effect that the universe is a flow of energy where forces of good and evil do battle, and humans act as conduits for those forces, or mediums, or foot soldiers, or even collateral damage in the cosmic war. However, all of that having been said, on the subject we're here to talk about, which is the political reality of the spiritual dimension, there's one way in which these modern paganisms differ radically from their original ancient counterparts, and I don't think we've taken stock of this sufficiently. And that is, ancient paganism was politically mainstream. And I would go further than that and say ancient paganism was a form of politics, and ancient politics was an expression of ancient religion. So the text I like to look at in this context is the Enuma Elish, which is our Sumerian creation legend. We get it on tablets in the various capitals of Assyria. In many ways mirrors Hesiod's Theogony, but is in some ways even more unadulterated in its expression of the pagan world myth. We find a story about how, from a swirling chaos of many waters, the Babylonian god Marduk rose out of chaos to dominate creation. And of course, this reflects the fact that Babylon at the time is the city that is most in power. In later versions of the story, however, we find that it's not Marduk who wins the battle of the god, but Ashur, who takes control of the world. What has changed in the intervening years between these two versions of the story? Well, of course, political Assyria, the actual embodied human politics, has surpassed Babylon as the dominant power. So naturally we conclude that we need to revise our story about the gods to say that actually Ashur and not Marduk is king of the universe. Why am I rattling on about this? Well, because in fact, most forms of ancient paganism involve some kind of reflection of the dominant regime. And it's not even necessarily an exaggeration to say that in the ancient world there is no such thing as politically marginal paganism, as the practice of a political minority. It's certainly true that different regions, different locales will worship different patron gods, but by and large, subject and regional peoples will either have their gods incorporated as minor entities in a larger pantheon that is in turn then governed by the ruling regime. Rome was really, really good at this. Or the alternative is your god gets annihilated by the conquering power. Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, when he conquered the Elamites, said, "I have counted their gods and goddesses as ghosts." So this is the fate of unsuccessful or marginal deities in original paganism. What that means is that you really don't have examples from the ancient world of paganism struggling to break in on a pre-existing dominant culture. So when we talk about a modern resurgence of the spiritual but not religious, when we talk about neo-paganism or paganism in the wreckage of Christendom or the wreckage of liberalism or whatever wreckage we happen to be living in, we're talking in some way about a meaningfully historically new phenomenon that is politically marginal and politically aggressive, hostile paganism, trying to break in from the outside, which accounts for the fact that unchurched spiritualism, when it expresses itself politically at all in our moment, tends to express itself not simply as a private form of self-improvement, but in terms of hostility, rebellion, and disaffection. And this cuts across, I would say, right and left and all sorts of political lines. Apocalyptic environmentalism obviously expresses itself by blockading public roadways and defacing cultural landmarks. These are statements to the effect that a rival system of values must replace whatever currently exists. Baptist vitalism, the Sun and Steel guys, when they are political, express themselves in a kind of anti-Christian paganism, contempt for America's role on the world stage. This often veers into a kind of conspiratorial anti-Semitism that's fixated particularly on the role of Israel. If you want to chase this up, look up any X account that is called some variety of Hellenist or real Hellenist. You'll read some wild stuff about how God is dead and Zeus is alive. This is Ed Gibbon literally on steroids. Like it's not a metaphor. This is like decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbons' argument there, translated into a kind of vitalist Nietzschean politics of force. And of course, technological messianism expresses itself in a post-human rejection of all that has previously been considered natural, our status as created entities, and all the political consequences that have been drawn from that, both by Christendom and by secular liberalism. What this means, and I will wrap up soon, is that I am coming to think that whether liberalism, secular liberalism, or Christianity, or some combination or mixture of the two, or some secret third thing, whatever ends up making a bid for senior partner in the future of Europe and America, whatever regime ideology takes the stage, that regime is going to have to contend not just with the rise of Islam via mass migration, not just with conspiratorial anti-Semitism within mainline Christianity, but also with any number of rival, unassimilated, spiritual but not religious competitor faiths. Neo-paganism is going to have to be dealt with somehow if we want a healthy and meaningful spiritual revival and not some kind of lapse into pre-Christianity. And I take it as read that would be a bad thing. If anybody disagrees with me, we can take it up over drinks. So liberalism, I think, has attempted in some ways to deal with irreligious spirituality, mainly through tolerance, which is to say privatization. When that doesn't work, it's tried to co-opt some of these movements into flattening in post-Enlightenment ideologies like BLM and diversity, and this has had sort of fissile and mixed results. But if that's not going to work, if wokeness is collapsing and we have to figure out something else, then actually Christendom needs to ask how it is going to relate to the rise of these neo-pagan, spiritual but not religious peoples. And the good news is that the Christian church actually has a long, complicated, and very rich tradition of asking exactly this question, namely, how is it that we relate to paganism? Do we think of it as a sort of natural revealed, or non-revealed, but natural reason that contains basic truths that are need of correction from Revelation? And do we therefore want to assimilate paganism? This is sort of the Augustinian approach, the Thomistic approach, and I think it might be taken fruitfully with guys, for instance, like Elon Musk, who seem to have some good instincts, but not a lot of clarity necessarily about what exactly is so special about the human person and how we can preserve it against our machines. Or is there also room for a kind of Tertullian-style approach, which is to say, what hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? This is all demon worship, and it needs cut off. And this is something that we might, in fact, have to say about, for instance, the idea that humanity is not a good species, which we saw earlier on. When it comes out of environmentalism, we might just have to reject that wholesale. But whatever strategy or mix of strategies we adopt, I just want to submit and kind of throw into the conversation that whoever figures out how to incorporate and react in a healthy way to the new paganism, to that regime belongs the future.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to take part in this conversation, very stimulating conversations around this hot topic of family. The previous speakers have already brilliantly addressed the mere question of the reasons underlying the demographic, the ongoing cultural crisis. So I'd like to take a slightly different approach, drawing from my field experience as a journalist covering Europe for EWTN. I cover the news with a special Catholic angle, which enables me to have a very good perspective on the current challenges that we are currently facing in Europe, in the West more generally, but more specifically in Europe. And at the same time, I'm witnessing some very interesting dynamics at play, some dynamics that are already emerging that are really making me think that renewal is really possible. Jonathan has just emphasized that populism, like any other political doctrine, cannot substitute for pietas, for transcendence, to bring about the reemergence of a fruitful civilization. What I found in my reporting is that, indeed, the mere beauty of a religion, its principle, its degree of sophistication itself, or even its power of conviction, are never enough to determine its social success. From a societal point of view, and it was always verified from my different investigations and studies, religion is above all an inherited culture. Family culture is the essential matrix for the perpetration of religion. And I must say, it is an area in which Christians, and specifically Catholics, are the least successful in Europe. I'm going to mention France a few times in this quick lecture. I'm French, of course. I have a very good perspective on my own country, but I think it's also, for another reason, I think it's a very interesting case study for understanding what is at stake right now in Europe, and the key elements to be taken into account also when building long-term strategies. France is indeed a symbol at the same time of the breakdown of the family unit, of de-Christianization, and the rapid spread of Islam. So a very interesting case study. I would mention first a recent study by French National Institute for Statistics and Economic Studies that showed that the generational reproduction rate for Islam in France is 91%. It's 84% for Jews and only 67% for Catholics, and it is the eldest daughter of the church. So the same dynamic, of course, can be seen elsewhere in Western Europe, maybe with an exception for countries like Portugal, where I've witnessed an enduring family tradition of transmission. So Portugal maybe stands out among other countries, but even Italy that has long been known for strong intra-family religious transmission, it has experienced a huge decline in the religious practice, especially during COVID, with at least 20%, a 20% decline in the religious practice following COVID-19. By contrast, the most observant Catholic families, and only them, particularly the so-called trad Catholics, demonstrate far higher transmission rates than mainstream Catholic families. It suggests that Christianity's survival in Europe will indeed depend on families who intentionally cultivate and protect their faith. I will call that the positive effect of the survival logic, because on the one hand, we have the alarming figures showing statistically that people without a religion or Muslim people may soon become a majority in Europe. It's a mathematical reality right now. And it is even more concerning as its foundations, the foundation of Europe, are inseparable of Christianity. So what is going to happen? And on the other hand, like as I mentioned in the introduction, we're already beginning to see that this unprecedented challenges is giving rise to a kind of awakening of the people. So this kind of survival logic was activated by the feeling of becoming a minority on the land of our own ancestors. This is giving rise to a rather unexpected renewal of faith. We are witnessing those signs of reawakening in the very places that were supposed to be the lasting bastions of secular progressivism. Sweden, Norway, France, all the nations, we all agree on that, at the forefront of de-Christianization. And there we are now seeing renewed interest in Christianity, specifically traditional Catholicism. It is something very recent, and I don't have a lot of very official figures about that, but it's completely undeniable for anyone going on the ground. I have figures for Norway so far. According to an estimate from an official Norwegian statistics site, registered members of the Roman Catholic Church have grown very fast in recent years, from 95,000 only in 2015 to over 160,000 in 2019. And it is not only the result of immigration. I spoke to religious leaders locally, and even Bishop Baden there, a prominent bishop, he confirmed that it's not only the result of immigration. It concerns a lot of young locals who are tired of this progressivism, of the lack of transcendence, and they are looking for meaning in their lives. So, of course, one key factor behind this shift, it's undeniable, is the presence of Islam and the growing presence of Islam in Europe, which is, of course, prompting young people of Christian heritage only, but de-Christianized, to reconsider their religious identity. This trend is reflected through the extraordinary success of some Christian initiatives. I'm thinking, for example, about the Exodus 90 challenge during Lent, designed originally for men, because there is this particularly strong need among men, and this course prescribes a very strong ascetic lifestyle. We have also the Pentecost Chartres pilgrimage, of course, where pilgrims walk from Paris to Chartres, and many of them are attached to the traditional Latin Mass. And each year right now, there are almost 20,000 participants, and the phenomenon is growing so fast that the organizers are unable to accommodate all of them. So they have to close registrations in advance. So the pilgrimage is a victim of its own success, which is something very interesting, and it's, again, super recent. There was a turning point that maybe started happening 5 years ago. So another very interesting phenomenon is the big trend around Lent that is completely unprecedented only this year. All across Europe, specifically on social media, it's quite funny, very interesting. Social media influencers were proudly displaying their cross on Ash Wednesday, which was something even last year you would not witness that. So what is going on? And I spoke to many, many parishioners in France, and there were a lot, even mainstream media were saying, oh, the churches across France were all packed for Ash Wednesday. What's going on? They were not able to accommodate of the faithful. A lot of people had to stay outside. So what is going on? it's quite obvious. Again, it's clearly a consequence of the growing visibility of Ramadan in the country. Young Catholics today also feel the need to make their own faith more visible. They are asking questions about themselves. If there are Christians, they wanted to show they don't want to be lukewarm anymore. And that's something unique to this new generation. I'm talking to influencers, Catholic influencers. When they do Q&As, they say, oh, it's weird because people from Christian traditions but not practicing Christians are asking questions about the faith. And they always tend to do that through the prisms of Islam. They say, oh, should I follow this strict rule and this strict rule? As if they were former Muslims, but it's just because they are going back to the faith through the prisms of Islam, which is a very interesting phenomenon. Of course, mention should be made of the boom in baptisms for young adults aged between 18 and 24 years old in France specifically. We don't have many figures for other countries, but in France, even the Bishops' Conference is communicating on that because they just have no idea what's going on. So we have official figures about this very sudden increase, again, very sudden. They rose by 20% in 2023 and by over 30% in 2024. And again, they already told me that new records are expected this year, and they're going to communicate about that right before Easter. Last year, right before Easter, I already interviewed a Lebanese priest in charge of welcoming ex-Muslim convert to Christianity in the Paris region. His name is Father Ramzi Sadeh. He told me that we had, of course, no official figures because most converts keep it a secret because they fear reprisals from their families, so it's very difficult to have precise numbers. But he told me that they represent easily some 20% of the total of new catechumens receiving baptism. So it's really not nothing. Some 20% of the newly baptized, it's really something. So these very rapid evolutions, which mainly concerns young people, show that, yes, these sociological studies that I mentioned before, all this prediction of the decline of Christianity in Europe, they are alarming indeed, and they are likely to happen, but they are not certain and they are not definitive. The trend could also rapidly be reversed by a subsequent return of traditional faith through the triptych of coherence, transcendence, and exigency. It appears very clearly. And it is so appealing to an increasing part of young Europeans. Yet, there is one crucial point that should be addressed, is that men are disproportionately drawn to this renewed and more rigorous form of Christianity that is also more easily transmissible between generations. Women, on the contrary, tend still to align more with, I would say, maybe I would dare, left-leaning movements such as New Age that were mentioned earlier, Wicca movements, because they perceive these movements are more compatible with feminism, the feminist values. A lot of these women see Christianity as the historical oppressor of women, the terrible patriarchy, the right wing. It is perceived as, yes, a continuous oppressor, but anyone familiar with the history of Christianity, of Christendom, knows it couldn't be further from the truth. I would mention, of course, scholars like Rudney Stark, historian Régine Pernoud, the wonderful French historian. They have demonstrated that Christianity was instrumental in the liberation of women in antiquity. The Middle Ages in particular saw women enjoying unparalleled autonomy and influence, engaging in the same profession as men, even reaching adulthood earlier than their male counterparts. Then the Renaissance and later bourgeois values of the 19th century, which was also a period where the church influence was actually in decline. This period confined women to restrictive roles and did erode their rights and freedom. It's undeniable. But Christianity, far from suppressing women, has always been a driving force for their empowerment. And that's a reality that must be reclaimed today. I would like to say that to all the Christian political, intellectual leaders. They must be aware of that and develop strategies accordingly. It is very important because the family transmission dynamic cannot be restored without making belonging to a religious community desirable for both family members. Everyone needs to be on board. And so the challenge for these leaders will thus be to shape a culture that is also appealing to women. And we need to be very smart about that. Christianity, once again, had the key to offering both genders a path to flourish, far remote from modern feminism and its Marxist rhetorics or the Red Pill movement undermining women all the time. So perhaps it is time to reclaim this treasure, this lost treasure. As a conclusion, the question is not whether faith will return. It is already returning. It's not a question. The real question is whether our Western societies, our institutions, will be able, ready to welcome this phenomenon. And in this sense, the media world, of course, will have a key role to play. That's precisely what also we are trying to do modestly with EWTN. We are trying to reshape a sustainable culture. And in this sense, I'm convinced that Christianity hasn't said its last word. And I really want to insist on that. I'd like to conclude by quoting, of course, André Malraux, the famous Minister of Culture under the Général de Gaulle. The famous statement that the 21st century will be religious or it won't be at all, which is certainly wrongly attributed to him, nevertheless captures, I think, a very interesting essence of his theory. He was not a believer, but Malraux understood very quickly in the 70s that without a shared sense of purpose, civilization becomes vulnerable to self-destruction. He was quite a visionary because in a letter in 1975, he said that the coming century could witness a great spiritual movement in the 70s, again, with the death of God. And he said probably a metamorphosis of Christianity. He compared this potential shift to the transformation that Christianity itself underwent in its early centuries. So, could we be on the verge of such a metamorphosis right now? I would say that the growing appeal of traditional Christianity among young Europeans, the resurgence of pilgrimages, this thirst for transcendence, this renewed interest in Catholicism's intellectual, mystical traditions, suggests that something profound is taking shape. But if Christianity is to regain its footing, it must rediscover the importance of family-based transmission, I insist on that, and collective religious identity. None of that will be able to happen. All this change, this metamorphosis will happen without a solid rebuilding of the family. And that's also why we're here today. Thank you very much.
Are these on? Yes, they are. Thank you so much for those four brief. I've taken over the Central European word interventions because I think it says more than talk or lecture or paper or these insufficient English words. It combines so much more. I wanted to throw a question out there and then allow you to ask one another one question each, so you can pick your favorite or at least favorites of your fellow presenters and ask a question. And my question is about moral exemplarism. A friend of mine completed a classics thesis in Oxford recently. His name's Dr. Brian Lapsa, on early Christianity, moral exemplarism, and also some responses to it amongst people like Julian the Apostate of trying to mimic this because they saw how effective it was. That is, someone like Jesus, someone like Paul, and then those who followed who were seen as exemplars of different virtues, and then persons who lived ages before who might not have had an inkling that they'd ever become a moral exemplar, like Alexander the Great, being also used to evangelize. Now, we don't really have, let's call them saints with a lowercase s in this way that are put out there from Christian culture to the culture, with the exception of maybe people like John Paul II more recently. But there are still persons like this. Che Guevara, I think for many people, serves a function to a very different set of people. But I lived in Amsterdam for many years, and you couldn't get around the fact that Saint Che was running around smelling like reefer. But there's also been others. There've been martyrs, people like George Floyd, who are talked about in these. I'm not saying this, but a sort of secular saint under COVID, treated in this way, treated as a martyr, right? And it's fulfilling. it's fulfilling a space that's absent in society. And
Greta is a prophet, right?
Greta has not yet been a martyr, except to many other people's causes, and that she's been dragged into sometimes willingly. But the other was mentioned, a potential saint, and that's Taylor Swift. No, really, maybe Beyonce is a better one, you know, or in Britain I've learned it's a fillet, not a fillet. So to me, she's Beyonce. So someone like Beyonce would be you know, having, if Taylor Swift had 7 children, it might change the cultural. But do you see persons that we should draw our attention to that could serve as these exemplars? And I'm arguing this because this is one of the great ways Christianity spread initially and overtook the paganism until finally it overtook the empire, and has been most successful is in terms of moral exemplars. And Protestants pretend they don't have saints, but you know, Calvin, Martin Luther, Zwingli, and all the rest serve these functions as well of moral exemplars of one way or another, and they even get the whole religion named after them eventually often. So if I can, I'll hand you the mic, and I'll be quiet from now on. And after you've answered my question, if you would take a moment to ask one another questions, and if it gets out of hand, I'll jump back in. Yes?
Please.
It's a terrific question. One thing we were discussing last night at dinner is, to me, one of the most interesting findings of Catherine's research, as I understand it, which is that it's not just highly religious people in highly religious communities who have more kids. It's also secular neighbors caught up in the gravity well of their fertility. And this is what René Girard would probably call the power of mimesis, right? There is an atmospheric pressure that changes when people around you are all doing one thing, something's normal. And yes, of course, like the paradigma, the exemplar, is a major dimension of this, and I would cite it as something that Christianity did, in fact, baptize and incorporate from earlier Roman models of, you know, the mos maiorum, these kind of great ancestral figures. What springs immediately to mind is the kind of rash of public intellectuals who have made either a profession of cultural Christianity or an outright conversion. So I'm thinking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I'm thinking about Paul Kingsnorth, Tom Holland, even with Dominion. There are, I'm sure, others who are currently slipping my mind. I mean, like a Russell Brand is sort of like on a knife's edge there. Jordan, well, I mean, this is... Yeah, Tammy Peterson. Yeah. Yeah, but these, you know, these people who are making either very public professions of faith, or at least staking their reputation behind the idea that it's not intellectually ludicrous to believe in a higher power. That's been a major, I think, like vector of the revival we're talking about. Douglas Murray is, sort of, again, on the periphery of that, I think. Or maybe, in this, I actually don't know what his religious status is.
I think it's a really good point that there is like the vibe shift includes the cultural, not just tolerance now, but celebration of like talking about the things of God. Joe Rogan is hosting 3-hour conversations about the supernatural, about angels and demons and miracles and the existence of God and all those things. So that has mainstream conversations, and I think it's probably made people curious in ways that and now the cool kids can talk about Jesus, right? And so I think that is kind of a change. That being said, you know, one of the beautiful things about the gospel and the fact that it is true is it does not, you know, it shows all the flaws of the central characters, right? We're not the good guys. And all of the heroes of the Bible are deeply, deeply flawed people. And Jesus is the good guy, right? And so the gospel does not need us to, like, see other people as the example. And I think when it comes to propagating the faith, I have seen no evidence that as long as the influencer that you follow most is faithful to the end, that your faith will be real, right? How are mom and dad doing? How did they treat you? What were the habits of the household? That determines whether faith will be propagated. And because the Holy Spirit is alive and well, he does not need Joe Rogan or anybody else to make that happen. So it's good when people can talk about things that matter, and so I think it's actually, I think the sexual revolution has caused so much pain, and it proposed a path to joy that was false. A lot of people have pursued it as aggressively as they know how, and they're more miserable than they have ever been. And because that has happened, there are a lot of people who are now curious to understand, why did that not work? And so there are gospel opportunities because of that. So that is more like the failure of the lie makes people curious about the truth. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be hypocrites and people aren't going to make mistakes. And that's just life in a broken world. And I think his truth is marching on regardless.
Yes, when I was a teenager, in school, I was supposed to translate a book. It was called God in Popular Culture. I was supposed to earn some money with translating that book. It's an American writer, I think a failed Jesuit, I think. And the idea was that you can find traces of God in Clint Eastwood movies, in Bruce Springsteen, in all these things. And we will find traces of religion in the entire culture, and that's a great thing. And I stopped translating after a while. I said, I can't stand this anymore. So it didn't appeal to me then. It doesn't appeal to me now to try to find... I honestly have to say I'm most inspired by people who put themselves out there in today's culture and speak about daily things and also the faith. Like Michael Knowles, for instance. Michael Knowles is fun, nice. Everybody likes him. He never crashes with anybody because he's so nice with everybody. But he will do deep Catholic testimony after having spoken about cigars and other things. And I think people look up to these kind of people, and they change lives, and they bring people to the faith. Another person that is sometimes seen with lots of anger in the United States, but that I personally appreciate very much, is Taylor Marshall. Taylor Marshall sometimes says things that people get angry about, but I know about hundreds, if not thousands of people who began to live a life as a Catholic because they listened to Taylor Marshall. These are people who begin going to Mass and to go to say their rosaries and pray as Catholics because they listened to Taylor Marshall. And I would always tell my more nervous Catholic friends when they speak about it, take a look at the effects and then ask yourself, sometimes some of the bishops who attack him, how many people do you lead to faith? This is real conversions and then lives that have changed because of one podcaster. And this is something that impresses me deeply. Because what I tried to say before is like, I had a few such conversations on Twitter beginning where I could give testimony of my faith. But these people do this every day, with their faults and their quirks and all of that, bringing thousands of people to a faith that will change their lives. I think this is deeply impressive.
Yes, I really agree. I think, especially considering Europe and the pop culture that has demonized Christianity and belief in transcendence, you're a fool when you're a believer in transcendence. And so, of course, we should not rely on a system that only is founded on influencers and things like that. But we need to take this shame out of global mentality, especially in a country like France, where, of course, if you're a Christian, you're immediately, demonized or making fun at. And I think it's extremely important to show that it can be trendy and that it can be also fancy to have a faith. I think we need also to have a strategy, because the counter-culture, the anti-clerical culture is so aggressive and so convincing through all these, even Netflix and all these different media that they have. It's extremely important to be able to show that actually we can be a force for good and be trendy at the same time.
Why don't you take the chance to ask the first question to one of your fellow panelists? Would you like to?
Could I begin, because I have to leave in about 3.5 minutes? I wanted to ask you, do you actually think that neo-pagan movements on Reddit are a real force in society? Is this just some fun 0.0 something percent online presence? Or is this reality in lives?
I can only answer this question anecdotally, although I would sort of recall my citation of these apocalyptic environmentalist movements. Earth worship, I think, is a major economically a driving force, politically a driving force, certainly in the States. It seems like in Europe, too. I mean, they do keep covering Stonehenge in orange paint and blocking the roadways. And this notion of antinatalism, that we should sacrifice ourselves on the altar of Mother Gaia, I think it has to be a contributing force in the kind of birth rate despair that we've been discussing. So certainly, I would say that's the most likely candidate for a major mainstream political movement, which has all the hallmarks of neo-paganism. It is earth worship, and it is often even depicted in those terms. So actually, I think, yes, absolutely. As I'm answering this question, I'm convincing myself 100%. But I was going to also tell the story of a fellow I met shortly before coming to this conference who, at a Catholic event, kind of started talking my ear off about ancient Assyria and about some of the kind of ancestral battles between good and evil that are now... And of course, it turns out he got this from like a guy on Rogan. And he seems to me representative of a certain type of young man who is, in fact, kind of listing in that direction. And I do think, these are young men who are major philosophical influences upon the Trump movement. The Bronze Age pervert is on the fringes of MAGA-ism, I think, in a serious way. I'm not exactly sure whether Curtis Yarvin counts as a neo-pagan, but there's certainly some commonality there. And I would just suggest that this. Oh, I was going to add to this Rod Dreyer's excellent article on his Substack. Rod Dreyer and I have just switched positions. He's in Nashville right now, and I'm in Budapest, and he is interviewing mainstream Christians in Nashville, and confirming something that I have experienced as well, which is that there is a deep and really kind of frank and unproblematized interest in mainline Christian churches in yogic astrology, in crystal therapy and Reiki, and these are all, again, those are people who probably show up on the Pew survey as Christians, as church-attending Christians, and in many ways perhaps are, but who are certainly all in on the idea that Venus in the microwave is going to change your chakras. That's... So anyway, I would just say, now that I'm thinking about it and answering your question, I'm convincing myself 110% yes.
So I'm afraid my left hand didn't know what the right was doing, and I'm going to give with one hand and take with the other and say, we're completely out of time, and I have to stop the panel right now, and we need to go on to the next bit of programming. So I'd like to ask everyone to thank our panelists.
Oh, thank you all for that. Just wonderful panel. What a joy. I just don't even have words. Okay, I want to give everybody 5 minutes to stretch their legs before our next presenter. We'll have 2 more presenters, and then our day is complete. But in the interest of blood flow, take 5. Okay, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, everyone. I hate to cut our 5-minute stretch break short, but I must, in the interest of time. Ding, 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 ding. I need a champagne flute. I'm always surprised when that works, but that works. Okay. It is a pleasure to introduce our penultimate speaker for the evening, Judith Regosh is a social policy expert, social worker, family counselor, university lecturer, and mother of 4. For over 25 years, she has been working with a constant drive to support families and parents. She is the founder of the Parents' House Model Program Family Center and the president of the Parents' House Foundation in Hungary. The innovative, complex parental support, family and childcare methodology she developed was awarded Best Practice by the European Union's Eurofund Foundation in 2012 and was internationally recognized by the World Bank's Good Practice in 2014. In 2022, the Parents' House Foundation was granted consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council and is an active participant of international events. As a university lecturer, Judith teaches a course on family studies, which is of great interest to future professionals. She's a permanent expert on various media platforms in Hungary. She undertakes family counseling and active analytic therapy with an empathetic and effective approach. She regularly gives science-based, yet entertaining presentations on motherhood and the challenges of family life to large audiences. Judith is also the author of 2 books, You're Not a Mom by Birth, and Divorce or Change. Judith, welcome.
Thank you very much and welcome you all, and thank you for staying here in this very end, and I hope you are not as tired, and very warm welcome for our American friends. I just have to tell you, I just came home from the US, and especially we meet in the Heritage Foundation with our friends there, so it's a very big pleasure to me to welcome you here in Hungary. So let me start by introducing myself, but not as long as it happened before. But I would like to introduce myself as a mother of 4 children, and I can call myself, you might call, family enthusiast. How I mean that? I think everybody who has family has very good memories from our childhood, but also sometimes we have not as good memories. And I think as you both, as parents, has good achievements with your children when you are proud of them and proud of yourself that you managed to make it. But also sometimes we fall sometimes, and we feel that we could do it better. And also I can tell you, in our foundation, we are dealing with children who doesn't have family, who are in foster care. So we have more than 600 beneficiaries, children, in our program. So I can tell you, in a kind of daily mother, I used to tell, of these children who are not have the opportunity to grow up in a family. So I know very well how good and more than good, essential to have a family where is a big power of emotional bonds in intergenerational cooperation, and it's very important of passing on positive tradition and heritage, while also working through generational traumas. And I believe that living in a supporting, loving family is not only good, it's essential for our health and happiness. On the other hand, living in a dysfunctional, blaming, emotionally harmful family where people hurt rather than support each other can be incredibly damaging. But I also believe that isolation is not the answer. The solution lies in supporting parents, families, and children so that more families can thrive emotionally, mentally, and socially. That's what I would like to talk to you about today. How we can build a caring society, one where people are not left alone and nobody can struggling alone. When we talk about well-being, we need to consider 3 key dimensions. mental well-being, social well-being, and economic well-being. These are all deeply interconnected. Mental health, support, or ability to connect with others, strong social connection can open economic opportunities. A stable economic environment reduces stress and allows both social and emotional growth. A caring society pays attention to all three. Governments have a vital role to play. They create the frameworks that allow people to flourish through social system, education, healthcare, family legislation, and financial support. A great example of this, the Hungarian family support system, which includes over 30 different measures aimed at helping families thrive, from tax benefits to housing, aid, and parental leave policies. As we heard it in these days, that some of you would like to be a Hungarian after that, knowing how many measures we have the families. So I won't repeat it all, but I would like to add of it, like the free and obligated kindergartens, which in Hungary we can live with it, free learning books in school, and also the growing number of nurseries. But the government cannot do all this alone. The civil society organizations work directly with people on the ground. They offer practical support, give voice to vulnerable groups, and provide experience-based insight to policymakers. They raise awareness, encourage community participation, build bridges between people, and they remind us that we are all in this together. We are the community, we are the pieces of the society. Communities are where big ideas become real, warm neighborhood, school initiative, or local parent group can make all the differences in a person's life. These spaces help prevent loneliness and isolation, two of the biggest challenges in today's world. In cooperative communities, people meet, share, and rebuild trust. This is where solidarity begins. As we used to say, to develop a child, it needs a whole village. And at the center, I could say, at the heart of all this is the family. This is where we first learn love, communication, resilience, pattern, good or sometimes bad, where we learn trust, bonds with healthy bonding capacity. Strong families create strong individuals, and strong individuals create stronger families, communities, and societies. But we also have to be honest. Family can be a place of trauma too, when people are not supported, when pain goes unaddressed, or when generational bonds are passed down. That's why supporting families is not just important, it's essential. We need to support families as whole systems, not just mothers, not just children, not just fathers' isolation. When a family is supported together, relationships become stronger and people become more capable of facing life's challenges together. Let me share with you a program that reflects this practical. Or I could tell you, let me introduce my fifth child, the Parents' House Foundation. The Parents' House program, or Szülők Háza, as we tell it in Hungarian, is a Hungarian initiative that embodies many of the values I've been spoken about. Our motto is simple: from family to community. It has been established by Dénes Kemény, who is a very well-known Hungarian three-time Olympic game winner of water polo, who is also a father of 4. It's about helping families grow, connect, and support one another. The goal of the program is to create inclusive, welcoming communities, places where families can meet, talk, and learn from each other with the help of professional parenting educators due to our teaching methodology. We provide emotional and local support, legal informational help related to family life, guidance for work-life balance. We take global knowledge and apply it locally, strengthening communities from the bottom up. We operate nowadays in 6 places in Hungary. We offer a wide variety of services: family-friendly events, community gathering, family nurseries, child development centers, summer camps for kids, parental counseling and guidance, educational workshops for families, and very special charity program called Do Something Good, Tegyél Jót. And we support children who are in state care and families in need. The Parents' House program has also grown beyond Hungary. It holds special consultative status with the United Nations, and with the World Bank endorsement, it operates in several countries like Morocco or in Ghana. It's recognized by the European Union as a best practice in parenting support and early childhood development. As we see in our work, the same values, connection, care, and community are relevant across cultures and borders. And let me close with this. Society thrives when families thrive, but families can't do it alone. They need visionary government policies, engaged civil society, supportive local communities, and most importantly, they need us as individuals who care. By investing in people, in relationships, and in the strength of families, we are not just helping others, we are building a healthier, more compassionate future for all of us. Thank you for listening.
Okay, our final speech for the day. It's a pleasure to reintroduce Philip Pilkington, who is a macroeconomist and former investment professional, the author of The Reformation in Economics and the forthcoming The Collapse of Global Liberalism. And he's here to talk about one of our most important topics, which unfortunately we did not have time to cover, but maybe we'll do this again. So, economics and fertility. Phil.
Thank you, Helen. It is about economics and fertility, but I want to take a slightly broader approach and talk about political philosophy, especially American political philosophy, recent American political philosophy. So family policy is actually much bigger than just family policy itself. Family policy is, in fact, the fulcrum on which the entire global conservative movement will soon turn. Big claim, I know. Give me a minute. The movement will have to redefine itself, root and branch, to accommodate family policy, and if it fails, our societies will be engulfed in a demographic winter that will cause economic and social collapse. More on that in a moment. I want to start by talking about something a bit broader, namely the American conservative movement. There are many Americans here today. That may sound a little obscure, but the reality is that most of the conservative movements in the Western world have taken their cue from the American conservative movement. Although what the Hungarians have been doing for the past 15 years is a little different. My thesis is that family policy and the problem of demographic decline that it addresses poses a fundamental problem for the American conservative worldview, typically referred to as fusionism. Fusionism has long been said to be the governing ideology of the American conservative movement since the 1960s. By extension, it has also become de facto governing principle of the rest of the Western European conservative movements. Long associated with the National Review under the stewardship of William F. Buckley, fusionism was an attempt to marry social conservatism and economic liberalism. But as is often the case with these terms, when we dig into the roots, we find complexities in the root hairs. Buckley himself was not responsible for the term. Rather, it was his senior editor, the ex-communist Frank Meyer. Meyer himself did not come up with the term, but rather had it assigned to him by Brent Bozell, who I would say was a proto-post-liberal thinker, you might say. He was a Catholic thinker. In his 1962 essay, Why Freedom?, Meyer responded to Bozell, "I should like to first plead innocent to your friendly indictment that I've laboured earnestly to promote and justify modern American conservatism as the fusion of the libertarian and traditionalist points of view. Rather, I've been attempting something very different from an ideological and eclectic effort to create a position abstractly fusing two other positions. What I've been attempting to do is to help articulate in theoretical and practical terms the instinctive consensus of the contemporary American conservative movement, a movement which is inspired by no ideological construct, but by devotion to the fundamental understanding of the men who made Western civilization and American republicanism," end quote. Here we see what is generally called fusionism, that is, the fusing of social conservatism and economic liberalism, is intimately tied up with what we might call founderism, that is, the tendency for American conservatives to construct their politics with reference to the Founding Fathers. No doubt the fusionists viewed themselves as the Founding Fathers themselves being fusionist, and so assumed that, were they alive today, the Founding Fathers would recognize in fusionism an inherent founderism. I don't really want to attack founderism. I would greatly appreciate if Europe had possessed their own version of founderism in the period when it was popular in America. I think it would have done Europe a lot of good. But founderism always struck me as having insurmountable problems as an outsider. Take the example of the Second Amendment. Gun control advocates love to point out how far weapons technology has come since the American Constitution was written. Would your founding fathers have allowed everyone in the United States to possess a tank, they ask impishly, or perhaps surface-to-air weapons that could take down a commercial jetliner? Even if you're in favour of the Second Amendment and like relative liberty of owning firearms, there is a logic to this argument, and it's hard to dismiss it. The Second Amendment clearly needs to consider changes in weapons technology. You can't allow surface-to-air missile systems to proliferate endlessly. Society would be chaos. It is the same for family policy. That would be my claim. I'm afraid in 1776, the average American woman would have around 7 children over her lifetime, God bless her. In 2022, she would have a meager 1.6. America's founding fathers simply could not conceive of a society that had so little interest in reproducing itself, and so we cannot expect to find anything resembling a solution in their writings or their statements. When Meyer wrote his response to Bozell at the beginning of the fusionist movement, the average American woman was still having 3.5 children, meaning that even the fusionist founderists would have had little to say about this grim phenomenon. I would like to call your attention to 3 papers that have been published in the last 2 years, which I bear at least partial responsibility for. The first is entitled Migration, Stagnation or Procreation, which I wrote with the demographer Paul Moreland and published with ARC. In this paper, we show that the immigration crisis faced by many Western countries is due to years of low birth rates and the need for external labour to supplement the domestic underproduction of people. Our shock finding in the paper was that, it was a paper focused on Britain, but this holds for most Western countries, if birth rates in Britain maintain their current trajectory, the percentage of the population that were first-generation immigrants, as in they were born elsewhere, would rise from 17% today to 54% in 2080. So the majority of the population would not have been born in the country. Britain would, in effect, become an airport rather than a country. The alternative to this, if they wanted to stop migration, would be basically economic collapse and the collapse of the welfare system and everything else. The second paper is entitled Small State or Small Families, which I also wrote with Moreland, and which was published recently by Policy Exchange. In the paper, we show that it is simply impossible to obtain the small state that libertarians hope for if we have small families. This is because as the population ages, the need for increased healthcare, pension, and social transfer payments leads to a massive increase in the size of government, naturally. Our shock findings in the paper showed that with current birth rates in the United Kingdom, again, this applies to every other country that's aging, but we took the example of the United Kingdom because it was published there, the United Kingdom would see the size of its government rise from 48% of GDP, which is already quite high, to 53% of GDP by 2080, just due to aging pressures. It would probably actually be a lot more. If the country moved to restrict immigration, which I believe they inevitably will, because it's completely out of control at the moment, government spending would rise from 48% to 58%. The government would grow as a share of the economy by 10%, on top of the already extremely large government sector. We already have a real-world example that doesn't need to be modelled in the case of Japan. Since 1990, Japan has seen a rapid ageing of its society due to a combination of low birth rates and relatively low immigration. Until recently, they've started immigrating now. Between 1990 and today, Japanese government spending rose from 30% of GDP to 45% of GDP. Japan went from effectively a small government country to a large government country. It has to borrow like a drunken sailor to fund this because the population are too old to pay into tax revenue to fund this state. And so Japan has by far the largest government debt in the world at 260% of GDP, which is enormous. The third paper is entitled Family Matters, Why Our Choices Determine Our Economic Prosperity. It was published with ARC only a few weeks ago. And I'm afraid to say I alone must take responsibility for this one. In this paper, I try to show that economists have led us down a bit of a garden path. Economists have long known that there are two long-term drivers of economic growth, and only two: productivity growth and population growth. But for reasons that are partly ideological and partly historical, they have ignored the population growth element and focused exclusively on productivity growth. This is despite the fact that if you look at the historical data, population growth has mattered much more, well, not much more, but more for overall economic growth than productivity. Between 1960 and 2022, productivity growth contributed on average about 1.5% of GDP a year in the United States. Population growth added about 2.1%, so quite a significantly larger amount. And what is more, the obsessive focus by policymakers and economists on productivity growth, you'll hear this in so-called supply-side reforms, trying to get regulations down, trying to increase technological developments, and so on. Productivity growth has fallen every decade, basically, since the 1960s. It's half what it was in the 1960s today. The reality is that no one really knows what economic productivity is beyond being a derived economic statistic. And so it's actually hard for it to come up with ways to increase it, which is why it's so frustrating that economists have focused on it so much. Population growth, on the other hand, whatever you want to say about family policy and whether it can get up births, it's pretty easy to understand what population growth is. We at least know what it is. So at least we have a target that we can, in theory, hit. Anyway, those are the three papers that lay out a pretty grim prospects for our society economically if we don't get the demographic issues under control. So I want to come back to fusionism. And again, this isn't just an American question. Most of the Western conservative movements have been influenced by the American conservative movement. Recall that Bozell accused Meyer of wanting to fuse social conservatism and economic liberalism. The implicit assumption here on the part of the fusionists is that economic liberalism was going to provide the basis for material prosperity. That was the promise. Yet when we look at fertility trends, we see little hope for any material prosperity on the horizon. Rather, we see a grim future of countries with low birth rates increasingly filled with random people from around the world, out of control growth in government, and perpetual economic stagnation. There is an enormous irony here. The fusionists scoffed at proto-post-liberals like Bozell, thinking that they had no idea how to generate economic prosperity. They saw them as naive traditionalists who had no way to deliver economic growth to the masses. Yet it is precisely the neglect of the family as the centre of society and of the economy that has led to extremely grim economic prospects in our own time. Much of this neglect was done to supposedly further the interests of economic growth. This is what the economic liberals asked us to do. In the past, those who raised questions about the impact of work obsession and hyper-consumerism on family life were dismissed as silly moralists who were getting in the way of economic progress. It is hard to see what sorts of solutions to this truly existential crisis libertarian or liberal economics can offer us. Left to itself, the market wants us to produce and consume as much as possible. That's just the nature of the market. Think about it for a moment. The ideal citizen of a liberal economy is one that maximizes the number of monetized transactions that they partake in. That's called GDP. It's also called corporate profits. On the income side, this means that you should work as much as possible. On the expenditure side, this means that you should consume as much as possible. Now consider the family. What does the family do from this perspective but discourage work and consumption? If you are looking after your children, you cannot work as much as you did before. If you are spending time with your family, you are not engaged in relationships that are monetized, except perhaps pocket money. It is hard not to see second and third wave feminism as simply ideologies of late-stage liberal capitalism as it started to run out of workers. No, the market has an incentive to channel people's activities has no incentive to channel people's activities into family life, if anything quite the opposite. Fusionist social conservatives can shout until they are blue in the face that the culture needs to change or that we need a religious revival. But birth rates continue to fall, and anyone who has not buried their head in the sand notices the connection between, say, for-profit swipe-till-you-drop dating apps and breakdown in trust between the sexes. We will not even mention the proliferation of the pornography industry. It is an industry. Many of these things are. Late-stage liberal capitalism, having satiated our desire for useful products like washing machines and access to running water, increasingly focuses on the monetization of social relationships, the promotion of anti-family lifestyles that are easier to monetize, and other types of parasitic rent extraction. Meanwhile, we begin to feel the chill of demographic winter all around us, which threatens to consume the material basis of our prosperity to begin with. Any solution to falling birth rates will not be libertarian in nature. Yes, we may utilize, say, tax cuts, as Hungary do. But this will be the use of the state's fiscal power to drive human behavior. It won't be a tax cut to shrink government, not necessarily, although it may have that effect down the line. It also won't be a fundamental attempt to get government out of our business, as economic liberals often like to think that we should. Given the indifference or even outright hostility market forces seem to have toward the family as they enter their mature phase and they start to penetrate all the social relationships to extract value, there seems very little option but for the government to get deeply involved in our business, lest our societies and economies collapse. But what social conservatives really need to understand today is that they possess the economic intellectual high ground now. It's not the 1960s or the 1950s when the fusionists are putting things together. Economic liberals have very little to say about the most profound economic problems that we face, much less how to solve them. Social conservatives are now the people best placed to gain sober stewardship over the economy by trying to increase the amount of people in our economy and ensure that they don't collapse. So I'll close with saying, fusionism is dead, long live post-liberalism.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have one indispensable responsibility for this conference. I didn't prevent it. The work has been done by a lot of people, some in our organisation, the Danube Institute, some in our partner organisations, but it's been done above all by two women, namely Helen Roy and my wife Melissa. I'm now going to hand over to them to conclude the conference by thanking the people they know should be thanked and by drawing any final conclusions they might want to draw. But on my behalf, ladies, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all for being here, and especially our audience members, the ones who stayed. Bravo to you. When Helen Roy first approached me with this concept for the program and then sent me a most magnificent outline to include many of the speakers that you saw before you over the past 2 days, I said, she has a genius. And I think we've all can agree. We've seen this genius on display in terms of her construction of the different panels, the speakers that she was able to bring here to join us. And my genius was supporting her and not interfering with any of her vision. So from the support standpoint, the Danube event staff, Valère, Beto, and Ben Say, who's not here in the room, who arranged all the travel for everyone and is getting you all back to the airport on time, arranging the taxis, to our most magnificent interns, which have been present throughout the 2 days, assisting everyone. To our corporate media, as where's Loretta? I don't see Loretta.
I think she's actually doing a media hit.
Oh,
right
okay,
now.
all right. And there's Christina and Betty, who did the marvelous graphics and had everything ready. To our great AV team up in the control town. Who am I leaving out? Anyone? To the foundation which makes it all possible by funding this event. We're just really grateful that it turned out so well, and we hope that will be an annual event. And I turn it over to Helen for the last word.
My only final word is thank you all so much for being here, especially our speakers, my friends. I'm so grateful. I feel so very blessed. Thank you.